Chapter 12. Objections. Let us now examine the principal objections put forth against communism. Most of them are evidently caused by a simple misunderstanding, yet they raise important questions and merit our attention. It is not for us to answer the objections raised by authoritarian communism. We ourselves hold with them. Civilized nations have suffered too much in the long, hard struggle for the emancipation of the individual, to disown their past work and to tolerate a government that would make itself felt in the smallest details of its citizens' life. Even if that government had no other aim than the good of the community, should an authoritarian socialist society ever succeed in establishing itself, it could not last. General discontent would soon force it to break up, or to reorganize itself on principles of liberty. It is of an anarchist communist society we are about to speak, a society that recognizes the absolute liberty of the individual, that does not admit of any authority, and makes use of no compulsion to drive men to work. Limiting our studies to the economic side of the question, let us see if such a society, composed of men as they are today, neither better nor worse, neither more nor less industrious, would have a chance of successful development. The objection is known, guaranteed, and if the necessity of earning wages does not compel men to work, nobody will work. Every man will lay the burden of his work on another if he is not forced to do it himself. Let us first remark the existence of each is incredible levity with which this objection is raised, without taking into consideration that the question is in reality merely to know, on the one hand, whether you effectively obtain by wage work the results you aim at, and, on the other hand, whether voluntary work is not already more productive too. They then work stimulated by wages, a question which would require profound study. But whereas in exact sciences men give their opinion on subjects infinitely less important and less complicated after serious research, after carefully collecting and analyzing facts, on this question they will pronounce judgment without appeal, resting satisfied with any one particular event, such as, for example, the want of success of a communist association in America. They act like the barrister, who does not see in the counsel for the opposite side a representative of a cause, or an opinion contrary to his own, but a simple adversary in an oratorical debate, and if he be lucky enough to find a repartee, does not otherwise care to justify his cause. Therefore the study of this essential basis of all political economy, the study of the most favorable conditions for giving society the greatest amount of useful products with the least waste of human energy, does not advance. They limit themselves to repeating commonplace assertions, or else they pretend ignorance of our assertions. What is most striking in this levity is that even in capitalist political economy you already find a few writers compelled by facts to doubt the axiom put forth by the founders of their science, that the threat of hunger is man's best stimulant for productive work. They begin to perceive that in production a certain collective element is introduced which has been too much neglected up till now, and which might be more important than personal gain. The inferior quality of wage work, the terrible waste of human energy in modern agricultural and industrial labor, the ever-growing quantity of pleasure-seekers, who today load their burden on others' shoulders, the absence of a certain animation in production that is becoming more and more apparent, all this begins to preoccupy the economists of the classical school. Some of them ask themselves if they have not got on the wrong track, if the imaginary evil being, that was supposed to be tempted exclusively by a bait of lucre or wages, really exists. This heresy penetrates even into universities. It is found in books of orthodox economy. This does not hinder a great many socialist reformers to remain partisans of individual remuneration, and defending the old citadel of wagedom. Notwithstanding that it is being delivered over stone by stone to the assailants by its former defenders, they fear that without compulsion the masses will not work. But during our own lifetime have we not heard the same fears expressed twice, by the anti-abolitionists in America before Negro emancipation, and by the Russian nobility before the liberation of the serfs? Without the whip the Negro will not work, said the anti-abolitionist. Free from their master's supervision, the serfs will leave the fields uncultivated, said the Russian serf owners. It was the refrain of the French noblemen in 1789, the refrain of the Middle Ages, a refrain as old as the world, and we shall hear it every time there is a question of sweeping away an injustice, and each time actual facts give it the lie. The liberated peasant of 1790, plowed with a wild energy unknown to his ancestors, the emancipated Negro works more than his fathers, and the Russian peasant, after having honored the honeymoon of his emancipation by celebrating Fridays as well as Sundays, has taken up work with as much eagerness as his liberation was the more complete. There, where the soil is his, he works desperately. That is the exact word for it. The anti-abolitionist refrain can be of value to slave owners. As to the slave themselves, they know what it is worth, as they know its motive. Moreover, who but economists taught us that if a wage earner's work is but indifferent, and intense and productive work is only obtained from a man who sees his wealth increase in proportion to his efforts. All hymns sung in honor of private property can be reduced to this axiom, for it is remarkable that when economists, wishing to celebrate the blessings of property, show us how an unproductive marshy or stony soil is clothed with rich harvest when cultivated by the peasant proprietor, they in no wise prove their thesis in favor of private property. By admitting that the only guarantee not to be robbed of the fruits of your labor is to possess the instruments of labor, which is true, the economists only prove that man really produces most when he works in freedom, when he has a certain choice in his occupations, when he has no overseer to impede him, and lastly, when he sees his work bringing in a profit to him and to others who work like him, but bringing in nothing to idlers. This is all we can deduct from their argumentation, and we maintain the same ourselves. As to the form of possession of the instruments of labor, they only mention it indirectly in their demonstration, as a guarantee to the cultivator that he shall not be robbed of the profits of his yield nor of his improvements. Besides, in support of their thesis, in favor of private property against all other forms of possession, should not the economists demonstrate that under the form of communal property land never produces such rich harvests as when the possession is private? But it is not so. In fact, the contrary has been observed. Take for example a commune in the canton of Vaud in the wintertime, when all the men of the village go to fell wood in the forest, which belongs to them all. It is precisely during these festivals of toil that the greatest ardor for work and the most considerable display of human energy are apparent. No salaried labor, no effort of a private owner can bear comparison with it. Or let us take a Russian village, when all its inhabitants mow a field belonging to the commune, or farmed by it. There you will see what man can produce when he works in common for communal production. Comrades vie with one another in cutting the widest swath. Women bestir themselves in their wake so as not to be distanced by the mowers. It is a festival of labor, in which 100 people do work in a few hours that would not have been finished in a few days had they worked separately. What a sad contrast compared to the work of the isolated owner. In fact, we might quote scores of examples among the pioneers of America, in Swiss, German, Russian, and in certain French villages, or the work done in Russia by gangs are tales of masons, carpenters, boatmen, fishermen, etc., who undertake a task and divide the produce or the remuneration among themselves, without it passing through the intermediary of middlemen. We could also mention the great communal hunts of nomadic tribes, and an infinite number of successful collective enterprises, and in every case we could show the unquestionable superiority of communal work compared to that of the wage earner or the isolated private owner. Well-being, that is to say, the satisfaction of physical, artistic, and moral needs, has always been the most powerful stimulant to work. And when a hireling produces bare necessities with difficulty, a free worker, who sees ease and luxury increasing for him and for others in proportion to his efforts, spends infinitely far more energy and intelligence, and obtains first-class products in far greater abundance. The one feels riveted to misery, the other hopes for ease and luxury in the future. In this lies the whole secret. Therefore is society aiming at the well-being of all, and at the possibility of all enjoying life in all its manifestations, will supply voluntary work which will be infinitely superior and yield far more than work has produced up till now under the goad of slavery, serfdom, or wagedom. Nowadays, whoever can load on others his share of labor indispensable to existence, does so, and it is admitted that it will always be so. Now work indispensable to existence is essentially manual. We may be artists or scientists, but none of us can do without things obtained by manual work: bread, clothes, roads, ships, light, heat, etc. And, moreover, however highly artistic or however subtly metaphysical are our pleasures, they all depend on manual labor. And it is precisely this labor, which is the basis of life, that everyone tries to avoid. We understand perfectly well that it must be so nowadays, because, to do manual work now, means in reality to shut yourself up for 10 or 12 hours a day in an unhealthy workshop, and to remain riveted to the same task for 20 or 30 years, and maybe for your whole life. It means to be doomed to a paltry wage, to the uncertainty of the morrow, to want of work, often to destitution, more often than not to death in a hospital, after having worked 40 years to feed, clothe, amuse, and instruct others than yourself and your children. It means to bear the stamp of inferiority all your life, because, whatever the politicians tell us, the manual worker is always considered inferior to the brain worker, and the one who has toiled 10 hours in a workshop has not the time, and still less the means, to give himself the high delights of science and art, nor even to prepare himself to appreciate them. He must be content with the crumbs from the table of privileged persons. We understand that under these conditions manual labor is considered a curse of fate. We understand that all men have but one dream, that of emerging from, or enabling their children to emerge from, this inferior state. to create for themselves an independent position, which means what? To also live by other men's work. As long as there will be a class of manual workers and a class of brain workers, black hands and white hands, they will be thus, what interest, in fact, can this depressing work have for the worker, when he knows that the fate awaiting him from the cradle to the grave will be to live in mediocrity, poverty, and insecurity of the morrow. Therefore, when we see the immense majority of men take up their wretched task every morning, we are surprised at their perseverance, at their zeal for work, at the habit that enables them, like machines blindly obeying an impetus given, to lead this life of misery without hope for the morrow, without foreseeing ever so vaguely that someday they, or at least their children, will be part of a humanity rich in all the treasures of a bountiful nature, in all the enjoyments of knowledge, scientific and artistic creation, reserved today to a few privileged favorites. It is precisely to put an end to this separation between manual and brain work that we want to abolish wagedom, that we want a social revolution. Then work will no longer appear a curse of fate. It will become what it should be, the free exercise of all the faculties of men. Moreover, it is time to submit to a serious analysis this legend about superior work, supposed to be obtained under the lash of wagedom. It is enough to visit, not the model factory and workshop that we find now and again, but ordinary factories, to conceive the immense waste of human energy that characterizes modern industry. For one factory more or less rationally organized, there are 100 or more which waste men's labor, without a more substantial motive than that of perhaps bringing in a few pounds more per day to the employer. Here you see youths from 20 to 25 years of age, sitting all day long on a bench, their chests sunken in, feverishly shaking their heads and bodies to tie, with the speed of conjurers, the two ends of worthless scraps of cotton, the refuse of the lace looms. What progeny will these trembling and rickety bodies bequeath to their country? But they occupy so little room in the factory, and each of them brings me in 6 pence a day, will say the employer. In an immense London factory you could see girls, bald at 17, from carrying trays of matches on their heads from one room to another, when the simplest machine could wheel the matches to their tables. But it costs so little, the work of women who have no special trade. What is the use of a machine? When these can do no more, they will be easily replaced. There are so many in the street. On the steps of a mansion on an icy night you will find a barefooted child asleep, with its bundle of papers in its arms. Child labor costs so little that it may well be employed, every evening, to sell 10 pennyworth of papers, of which the poor boy will receive a penny, or a penny halfpenny. And lastly, you may see a robust man tramping, dangling his arms. He has been out of work for months. Meanwhile, his daughter grows pale in the overheated vapors of the workshop for dressing stuffs, and his son fills blacking pots by hand, or waits hours at the corner of a street till a passerby enables him to earn a penny. And so it is everywhere, from San Francisco to Moscow, and from Naples to Stockholm. The waste of human energy is the distinguishing and predominant trait of industry, not to mention trade where it attains still more colossal proportions. What a sad satire is that name, political economy, given to the science of waste of energy under the system of wagedom. This is not all. If you speak to the director of a well-organized factory, he will naively explain to you that it is difficult nowadays to find a skillful, vigorous, and energetic workman who works with a will. Should such a man present himself among the 20 or 30 who call every Monday asking us for work, he is sure to be received, even if we are reducing the number of our hands. We recognize him at the first glance, and he is always accepted, even though we have to get rid of an older and less active worker the next day, and the one who has just received notice to quit, and all those who receive it tomorrow, go to reinforce that immense reserve army of capital workmen out of work who are only called to the loom or the bench when there is pressure of work, or to oppose strikers. And those others, the average workers that are the refuse of the better-class factories, they join the equally formidable army of aged and indifferent workers that continually circulates between the second-class factories, those which barely cover their expenses and make their way in the world by trickery and snares laid for the buyer, and especially for the consumer in distant countries. And if you talk to the workmen themselves, you will soon learn that the rule in such factories is never to do entirely what you are capable of. Shoddy pay, shoddy work. This is the advice which the working man receives from his comrades upon entering such a factory. For the workers know that if in a moment of generosity they give way to the entreaties of an employer and consent to intensify the work in order to carry out a pressing order, this nervous work will be exacted in the future as a roll in the scale of wages. Therefore, in all such factories they prefer never to produce as much as they can. In certain industries production is limited so as to keep up high prices, and sometimes the password "Kokeni" is given, which signifies bad work, for bad wage work is serf work. It cannot, it must not produce all that it could produce. And it is high time to disbelieve the legend which represents wagedom as the best incentive to productive work. If industry nowadays brings in 100 times more than it did in the days of our grandfathers, it is due to the sudden awakening of physical and chemical sciences towards the end of last century, not to the capitalist organization of wagedom. But in spite of that organization, those who have seriously studied the question do not deny any of the advantages of communism, on condition, be it well understood, that communism be perfectly free, that is to say, anarchist. They recognize that work paid with money, even disguised under the name of labor notes, to workers, associations governed by the state, would keep up the characteristics of wagedom and would retain its disadvantages. They agree that the whole system would soon suffer from it, even if society came into possession of the instruments of production. And they admit that, thanks to integral education given to all children, to the laborious habits of civilized societies, with the liberty of choosing and varying their occupations and the attractions of work done by equals for the well-being of all, the communist society would not be wanting in producers who would soon make the fertility of the soil triple and tenfold, and give a new impulse to industry. This our opponents agree to. But the danger, they say, will come from that minority of loafers who will not work, and will not have regular habits in spite of excellent conditions that make work pleasant. Today the prospect of hunger compels the most refractory to move along with the others. The one who does not arrive in time is dismissed. But a black sheep suffices to contaminate the whole flock, and 2 or 3 sluggish or refractory workmen lead the others astray and bring a spirit of disorder and rebellion into the workshop that makes work impossible, so that in the end we shall have to return to a system of compulsion that forces the ringleaders back into the ranks. And is not the system of wages paid in proportion to work performed, the only one that enables compulsion to be employed, without hurting the feelings of the worker? Because all other means would imply the continual intervention of an authority that would be repugnant to free men. This, we believe, is the objection fairly stated. It belongs to the category of arguments which try to justify the state, the penal law, the judge, and the jailer, as there are people, a feeble minority, who will not submit to social customs. The authoritarians say, we must maintain magistrates, tribunals, and prisons. Although these institutions become a source of new evils of all kinds, therefore we can only repeat what we have so often said concerning authority in general. To avoid a possible evil you have recourse to means which in themselves are a greater evil, and become the source of those same abuses that you wish to remedy. For do not forget that it is wagedom, the impossibility of living otherwise than by selling your labor, which has created the present capitalist system, whose vices you begin to recognize. Let us also remark that this authoritarian way of reasoning is but a justification of what is wrong in the present system. Wagedom was not instituted to remove the disadvantages of communism. Its origin, like that of the state and private ownership, is to be found elsewhere. It is born of slavery and serfdom imposed by force, and only wears a more modern garb. Thus the argument in favor of wagedom is as valueless as those by which they seek to apologize for private property and the state. We are, nevertheless, going to examine the objection, and see if there is any truth in it. To begin with, is it not evident that if a society, founded on the principle of free work, were really menaced by loafers, it could protect itself without an authoritarian organization, and without having recourse to wagedom? Let us take a group of volunteers, combining for some particular enterprise. Having its success at heart, they all work with a will, save one of the associates, who is frequently absent from his post. Must they on his account dissolve the group, elect a president to impose fines, or maybe distribute markers for work done, as is customary in the academy? It is evident that neither the one nor the other will be done, but that some day the comrade who imperils their enterprise will be told, friend, we should like to work with you, but as you are often absent from your post, and you do your work negligently, we must part. Go and find other comrades who will put up with your indifference. 11. This way is so natural that it is practiced everywhere nowadays, in all industries, in competition with all possible systems of fines, docking of wages, supervision, etc. A workman may enter the factory at the appointed time, but if he does his work badly, if he hinders his comrades by his laziness or other defects, and they quarrel with him on that account, there is an end of it. He is compelled to leave the workshop. Authoritarians pretend that it is the almighty employer and his overseers who maintain regularity and quality of work in factories. In fact, in a somewhat complicated enterprise, in which the wares produced pass through many hands before being finished, it is the factory itself, the workmen as a unity, who see to the good quality of the work. Therefore the best factories of British private industry have few overseers, far less on an average than the French factories, and less than the British state factories. A certain standard of public morals is maintained in the same way. Authoritarians say it is due to rural guards, judges, and policemen, whereas in reality it is maintained in spite of judges, policemen, and rural guards. Many are the laws producing criminals. 11 has been said long ago, not only in industrial workshops do things go on in this way. It happens everywhere, every day, on a scale that only bookworms have as yet no notion of. When a railway company, federated with other companies, fails to fulfill its engagements, when its trains are late and goods lie neglected at the stations, the other companies threaten to cancel the contract, and that threat usually suffices. It is generally believed, at any rate it is taught, that commerce only keeps to its engagements from fear of lawsuits. Nothing of the sort. 9 times in 10 the trader who has not kept his word will not appear before a judge. There, where trade is very great, as in London, the sole fact of having driven a creditor to bring a lawsuit suffices for the immense majority of merchants to refuse for good to have any dealings with the man who has compelled one of them to go to law. Then, why should means that are used to, they among mates in the workshop, traders, and railway companies, not be made use of in a society based on voluntary work? Take for example an association stipulating that each of its members should carry out the following contract: we undertake to give you the use of our houses, stores, streets, means of transport, schools, museums, etc., on condition that, from 20 to 45 or 50 years of age, you consecrate 4 or 5 hours a day to some work recognized as necessary to existence. Choose yourself the producing groups which you wish to join, or organize a new group, provided that it will undertake to produce necessaries. And as for the remainder of your time, combine together with those you like for recreation, art, or science, according to the bent of your taste, 12 or 1500 hours of work a year, in a group producing food, clothes or houses, or employed in public health, transport, etc., is all we ask of you. For this work we guarantee to you all that these groups produce or will produce. But if not one of the thousands of groups of our federation will receive you, whatever be their motive, if you are absolutely incapable of producing anything useful, or if you refuse to do it, then live like an isolated man or like an invalid. If we are rich enough to give you the necessaries of life, we shall be delighted to give them to you. You are a man, and you have the right to live. But as you wish to live under special conditions, and leave the ranks, it is more than probable that you will suffer for it in your daily relations with other citizens. You will be looked upon as a ghost of bourgeois society, unless some friends of yours, discovering you to be a talent, kindly free you from all moral obligation towards society by doing necessary work for you. And lastly, if it does not please you, go and look for other conditions elsewhere in the wide world, or else seek adherents and organize with them on novel principles. We prefer our own. That is what could be done in a communal society in order to turn away sluggards if they became too numerous. We very much doubt that we need fear this contingency in a society really based on the entire freedom of the individual. In fact, in spite of the premium on idleness offered by private ownership of capital, the really lazy man, unless he is ill, is comparatively rare. Among workmen it is often said that bourgeois are idlers. There are certainly enough of them, but they too are the exception. On the contrary, in every industrial enterprise, you are sure to find one or more bourgeois who work very hard. It is true that the majority of bourgeois profit by their privileged position to award themselves the least unpleasant tasks, and that they work under hygienic conditions of air, food, etc., which permit them to do their business without too much fatigue. But these are precisely the conditions which we claim for all workers, without exception. We must also say that if, thanks to their privileged position, rich people often make absolutely useless or even harmful work in society, nevertheless the ministers, heads of departments, factory owners, traders, bankers, etc., subject themselves for a few hours a day to work which they find more or less tiresome, all preferring their hours of leisure to this obligatory work, and if in 9 cases out of 10 this work is fateful, they find it none the less tiring for that. But it is precisely because the middle class put forth a great energy, even in doing harm, knowingly or not, and defending their privileged position, that they have succeeded in defeating the landed nobility, and that they continue to rule the masses. If they were idlers they would long since have ceased to exist, and would have disappeared like the aristocrats. In a society that would expect only 4 or 5 hours a day of useful, pleasant, and hygienic work, they would perform their task perfectly. And they certainly would not put up with the horrible conditions in which men toil nowadays without reforming them. If a Huxley spent only 5 hours in the sewers of London, rest assured that he would have found the means of making them as sanitary as his physiological laboratory. As to the laziness of the great majority of workers, only Philistine economists and philanthropists say such nonsense. If you ask an intelligent manufacturer, he will tell you that if workmen only put it into their heads to be lazy, all factories would have to be closed. For no measure of severity, no system of spying would be of any use. You should have seen the terror caused in 1887 among British employers when a few agitators started preaching the Gokeni theory for bad pay bad work. Take it easy, do not overwork yourselves and waste all you can. They demoralize the worker, they want to kill industry, cry those who formerly inveighed against the immorality of the worker and the bad quality of his work. But if the worker were what he is represented to be, namely, the idler whom you have continually to threaten with dismissal from the workshop, what would the word demoralization signify? So when we speak of a possible idleness, we must well understand that it is a question of a small minority in society, and before legislating for that minority, would it not be wise to study its origin? Whoever observes with an intelligent eye sees well enough that the child reputed lazy at school is often the one which does not understand what he is badly taught. Very often, too, it is suffering from cerebral anemia, caused by poverty and an anti-hygienic education. The boy who is lazy at Greek or Latin would work admirably were he taught in science, especially if taught by the medium of manual labor. The girl reputed not at mathematics becomes the first mathematician of her class if she by chance meets somebody who can explain to her the elements of arithmetic she did not understand. And a workman, lazy in the workshop, cultivates his garden at dawn, while gazing at the rising sun, and will be at work again at nightfall, when all nature goes to its rest. Somebody said that dirt is matter in the wrong place. The same definition applies to 9/10 of those called lazy. They are people gone astray in a direction that does not answer to their temperament nor to their capacities. In reading the biography of great men, we are struck with the number of idlers among them. They were lazy as long as they had not found the right path, and afterwards laborious to excess. Darwin, Stevenson, and many others belong to this category of idlers. Very often the idler is but a man to whom it is repugnant to make all his life the 18th part of a pin, or the 100th part of a watch, while he feels he has exuberant energy which he would like to expend elsewhere. Often, too, he is a rebel who cannot submit to being fixed all his life to a workbench in order to procure 1,000 pleasures for his employer, while knowing himself to be far the less stupid of the two, and knowing his only fault to be that of having been born in a hovel instead of coming into the world in a castle. Lastly, a good many idlers do not know the trade by which they are compelled to earn their living, seeing the imperfect thing made by their own hands, striving vainly to do better, and perceiving that they never will succeed on account of the bad habits of work already acquired, they begin to hate their trade, and not knowing any other, hate work in general. Thousands of workmen and artists who are failures suffer from this cause. On the other hand, he who since his youth has learned to play the piano well, to handle the plans well, the chisel, the brush or the file, so that he feels that what he does is beautiful, will never give up the piano, the chisel, or the file. He will find pleasure in his work which does not tire him, as long as he is not overdriven, under the one name, idleness. A series of results due to different causes have been grouped, of which each one could be a source of good, instead of being a source of evil to society. Like all questions concerning criminality and related to human faculties, facts have been collected having nothing in common with one another. They say laziness or crime, without giving themselves the trouble to analyze their cause. They are in haste to punish them, without inquiring if the punishment itself does not contain a premium on laziness or crime. This is why a free society, seeing the number of idlers increasing in its midst, would no doubt think of looking for the cause of laziness, in order to suppress it, before having recourse to punishment. When it is a case, as we have already mentioned, of simple bloodlessness, then, before stuffing the brain of a child with science, nourish his system so as to produce blood, strengthen him, and that he shall not waste his time. Take him to the country, or to the seaside. There, teach him in the open air, not in books geometry, by measuring the distance to a spire, or the height of a tree, natural sciences, while picking flowers and fishing in the sea, physical science. While building the boat he will go to fishing. But for mercy's sake, do not fill his brain with sentences and dead languages. Do not make an idler of him. Such a child has neither order nor regular habits. Let first the children inculcate order among themselves, and later on, the laboratory, the workshop, work done in a limited space, with many tools about, will teach them method. But do not make disorderly beings out of them by your school, whose only order is the symmetry of its benches, and which true image of the chaos in its teachings will never inspire anybody with the love of harmony, of consistency, and method in work. Do not you see that by your methods of teaching, framed by a ministry for 8 million scholars, who represent 8 million different capacities, you only impose a system good for mediocrities, conceived by an average of mediocrities? Your school becomes a university of laziness, as your prison is a university of crime. Make the school free, abolish your university grades, appeal to the volunteers of teaching. Begin that way, instead of making laws against laziness which only serve to increase it. Give the workman who is compelled to make a minute particle of some object, who is stifled at his little tapping machine, which he ends by loathing, give him the chance of tilling the soil, felling trees in the forest, sailing the seas in the teeth of a storm, dashing through space on an engine, but do not make an idler of him by forcing him all his life to attend to a small machine, to plow the head of a screw, or to drill the eye of a needle. Suppress the cause of idleness, and you may take it for granted that few individuals will really hate work, especially voluntary work, and that there will be no need to manufacture a code of laws on their account. Chapter 13. The collectivist wages system. It is our opinion that collectivists committed twofold error in their plans for the reconstruction of society, while speaking of abolishing capitalist rule. They intend nevertheless to retain two institutions which are the very basis of this rule, and the wages system, as regards so-called representative government. We have often spoken about it. It is absolutely incomprehensible to us that intelligent men and such are not wanting in the collectivist party remain partisans of national or municipal parliaments after all the lessons history has given them in France, in England, in Germany, or in the United States, while we see parliamentary rule breaking up, and from all sides criticism of this rule growing louder, not only of its results, but also of its principles. That revolutionary socialists defend a system already condemned to die. Representative government can how is built up by the middle classes to hold their own against royalty, sanctioning, and at the same time strengthening, their sway over the workers. Parliamentary rule is preeminently a middle class rule. The upholders of this system have never seriously affirmed that a parliament or a municipal council represent a nation or a city. The most intelligent among them know that this is impossible. The middle class has simply used the parliamentary system to raise a barrier between itself and royalty, without giving the people liberty. But gradually, as the people become conscious of their interests and the variety of their interests multiply, the system can no longer work. Therefore Democrats of all countries vainly imagine diverse palliatives. The referendum is tried and found to be a failure. Proportional representation is spoken of, so is representation of minorities and other parliamentary utopias. In a word, they strive to find what is not to be found, and they are compelled to recognize that they are in the wrong way, and confidence in a representative government disappears. It is the same with the wages system, for after having proclaimed the abolition of private property, and the possession in common of all means of production, how can they uphold the wages system in any form? It is, nevertheless, what collectivists are doing when they recommend labor checks. It is easy to understand why the early English socialists came to the system of labor checks. They simply tried to make capital and labor agree. They repudiated the idea of violently laying hands on capitalist property. It is also easily understood why Proudhon took up the idea later on. In his mutualist system he tried to make capital less offensive, notwithstanding the retaining of private property, which he detested from the bottom of his heart, but which he believed to be necessary to guarantee individuals against the state. Neither is it astonishing that certain economists, more or less bourgeois, admit labor checks. They care little whether the worker is paid in labor notes or in coins stamped with the effigy of the Republic or the Empire. They only care to save from destruction individual ownership of dwelling houses, of land, of factories. In any case that of dwelling houses and the capital that is necessary for manufacturing. And labor notes would just answer the purpose of upholding this private property. As long as labor notes can be exchanged for jewels or carriages, the owner of the house will willingly accept them for rent. And as long as dwelling houses, fields, and factories belong to isolated owners, men will have to pay them in one way or another, for being allowed to work in the fields or factories, or for living in the houses. The owners will accept to be paid by the workers in gold, in paper money, or in checks exchangeable for all sorts of commodities. But how can we defend labor notes, this new form of wagedom, when we admit that houses, fields, and factories will no longer be private property, and that they will belong to the commune or the nation? Let us closely examine this system of remuneration for work done, preached by French, German, English, and Italian collectivists, Spanish anarchists, who still call themselves collectivists. Imply by collectivism the possession in common of all instruments of production, and the liberty of each group to divide the produce, as they think fit, according to communist or any other principles. It amounts to this: everybody works in field, factory, school, hospital, etc. The working day is fixed by the state, which owns land, factories, roads, etc. Every work day is paid for with a labor note, which is inscribed with these words: 8 hours work. With this check the worker can procure all sorts of merchandise in the stores owned by the state or by divers corporations. The check is divisible, so that you can buy an hour's work worth of meat, 10 minutes worth of matches, or half an hour of tobacco. After the collectivist revolution, instead of saying 2 pence worth of soap, we shall say 5 minutes worth of soap. Most collectivists, true to the distinction laid down by middle-class economists and by Marx, between qualified work and simple work, tell us, moreover, that qualified or professional work must be paid a certain quantity more than simple work. Thus an hour's work of a doctor will have to be considered as equivalent to 2 or 3 hours work of a hospital nurse, or to 3 hours work of a navvy. Professional or qualified work will be a multiple of simple work, says the collectivist Gronlund, because this kind of work needs a more or less long apprenticeship. Other collectivists, such as the French Marxists, do not make this distinction. They proclaim equality of wages. The doctor, the schoolmaster, and the professor will be paid in labor checks, at the same rate as the navvy. 8 hours visiting the sick in a hospital will be worth the same as 8 hours spent in earthworks or else in mines or factories. Some make a greater concession. They admit that disagreeable or unhealthy work such as sewerage could be paid for at a higher rate than agreeable work. 1 hour's work of a sermon would be worth, they say, 2 hours of a professor's work. Let us add that certain collectivists admit of corporations paying a lump sum for work done. Thus a corporation would say, here are 100 tons of steel. 100 workmen were required to produce them, and it took them 10 days. Their workday being an 8-hour day, it has taken them 8,000 working hours to produce 100 tons of steel. For this the state would pay them 8,000 labor notes of 1 hour each, and these 8,000 checks would be divided among the members of the ironworks, as they themselves thought proper. On the other hand, 100 miners having taken 20 days to extract 8,000 tons of coal would be worth 2 hours a ton, and the 16,000 checks of 1 hour each, received by the Guild of Miners, would be divided among their members according to their own appreciation. If the miners protested, and said that a ton of steel should only cost 6 hours work instead of 8, if the professor wished to have his day paid twice more than the nurse, then the state would interfere and would settle their differences, such as, in a few words, the organization collectivists wish to see arise out of the social revolution. As we see, their principles are collective property of the instruments of production, and remuneration to each according to the time spent in producing, while taking into account the productivity of his labor. As to the political system, it would be parliamentarianism modified by positive instructions given to those elected by the referendum of vote, taken by noes or ayes by the nation. Let us own that this system appears to us unrealizable. Collectivists begin by proclaiming a revolutionary principle, the abolition of private property, then they deny it no sooner than proclaimed by upholding an organization of production and consumption that originated in private property. They proclaim a revolutionary principle, and ignore the consequences that this principle will inevitably bring about. They forget that the very fact of abolishing individual property and the instruments of workland, factories, road, capital, must launch society into absolutely new channels, must completely overthrow the present system of production, both in its aim as well as in its means, must modify daily relations between individuals. As soon as land, machinery, and all other instruments of production are considered common property, they say, no private property, and immediately after strive to maintain private property in its daily manifestations. You shall be a commune as far as regards production, fields, tools, machinery, all that has been invented up till now, factories, railways, harbors, mines, etc. All are yours. Not the slightest distinction will be made concerning the share of each in this collective property, but from tomorrow you will minutely debate the share you are going to take in the creation of new machinery, in the digging of new mines. You will carefully weigh what part of the new produce belongs to you. You will count your minutes of work, and you will take care that a minute of your neighbors cannot buy more than yours. And as an hour measures nothing, as in some factories a worker can see to 6 power looms at a time, while in another he only tends to, you will weigh the muscular force, the brain energy, and the nervous energy you have expended. You will accurately calculate the years of apprenticeship in order to appraise the amount each will contribute to future production, and this after having declared that you do not take into account his share in past production. Well, for us it is evident that a society cannot be based on two absolutely opposed principles, two principles that contradict one another continually, and a nation or a commune that would have such an organization would be compelled to revert to private property in the instruments of production, or to transform itself immediately into a communist society. We have said that certain collectivist writers desire that a distinction should be made between qualified or professional work and simple work. They pretend that an hour's work of an engineer, an architect, or a doctor must be considered as 2 or 3 hours work of a blacksmith, a mason, or a hospital nurse, and the same distinction must be made between all sorts of trades, necessitating a more or less long apprenticeship, and the simple toil of day laborers. Well, to establish this distinction would be to maintain all the inequalities of present society. It would mean fixing a dividing line, from the beginning, between the workers and those who pretend to govern them. It would mean dividing society into two very distinct classes: the aristocracy of knowledge above the horny-handed lower orders, the one doomed to serve the other, the one working with its hands to feed and clothe those who, profiting by their leisure, study how to govern their fosterers. It would mean reviving one of the distinct peculiarities of present society and giving it the sanction of the social revolution. It would mean setting up as a principle an abuse already condemned in our ancient crumbling society. We know the answer we shall get. They will speak of scientific socialism. They will quote bourgeois economists and Marx to prove that a scale of wages has its raison d'etre, as the labor force of the engineer will have cost more to society than the labor force of the navvy. In fact, have not economists tried to prove to us that if an engineer is paid 20 times more than a navvy, it is because the necessary outlay to make an engineer is greater than that necessary to make a navvy? And has not Marx asserted that the same distinction is equally logical between two branches of manual labor? He could not conclude otherwise, having on his own account taken up Ricardo's theory of value, and upheld that goods are exchanged in proportion to the quantity of work socially necessary for their production. But we know what to think of this. We know that if engineers, scientists, or doctors are paid 10 or 100 times more than a laborer, and that a weaver earns 3 times more than an agricultural laborer, and 10 times more than a girl in a match factory, it is not by reason of their cost of production, but by reason of a monopoly of education, or a monopoly of industry. Engineers, scientists, and doctors merely exploit their capital, their diplomas, as middle-class employers exploit a factory, or as nobles used to exploit their titles of nobility. As to the employer who pays an engineer 20 times more than a laborer, it is simply due to personal interest. If the engineer can economize £4,000 a year on the cost of production, the employer pays him £800, and if the employer has a foreman who saves £400 on the work by cleverly sweating workmen, he gladly gives him £80 or £120 a year. He parts with an extra £40 when he expects to gain £400 by it. And this is the essence of the capitalist system. The same difference is obtained among divers manual trades. Let them therefore not talk to us of the cost of production, which raises the cost of skilled labor, and tell us that a student who has gaily spent his youth in a university has a right to a wage 10 times greater than the son of a miner who has grown pale in a mine since the age of 11. Or that a weaver has a right to a wage 3 or 4 times greater than that of an agricultural laborer. The cost of teaching a weaver his work is not 4 times greater than the cost of teaching a peasant his. The weaver simply benefits by the advantages his industry reaps in Europe, in comparison with countries that have as yet no industries. Nobody has ever calculated the cost of production, and if a loafer costs far more to society than a worker, it remains to be seen whether a robust day laborer does not cost more to society than a skilled artisan. When we have taken into account infant mortality among the poor, the ravages of anarchy and premature deaths, could they, for example, make us believe that the 1s. 3d paid to a Paris workwoman, the 3d paid to an Auvergne peasant girl who grows blind at lace making, or the 1s. 8d paid to the peasant represent their cost of production? We know full well that people work for less. But we also know that they do so exclusively because, thanks to our wonderful organization, they would die of hunger did they not accept these mock wages. For us the scale of remuneration is a complex result of taxes, of governmental tutelage, of capitalist monopoly. In a word, of state and capital. Therefore, we say that all wages theories have been invented after the event to justify injustices at present existing, and that we need not take them into consideration. Neither will they fail to tell us that the collectivist scale of wages would be an improvement. It would be better, so they say, to see certain artisans receiving a wage 2 or 3 times higher than common laborers, than to see a minister receiving in a day what a workman cannot earn in a year. It would be a great step towards equality for us. This step would be the rivers of progress. To make a distinction between simple and professional work in a new society would result in the revolution sanctioning and recognizing as a principle a brutal fact we submit to nowadays, but that we nevertheless find unjust. It would mean imitating those gentlemen of the French Assembly who proclaimed August 4, 1789, the abolition of feudal rights, but who on August 8 sanctioned these same rights by imposing dues on the peasants to compensate the noblemen, placing these dues under the protection of the revolution. It would mean imitating the Russian government, which proclaimed, at the time of the emancipation of the serfs, that the lands should henceforth belong to the nobility, while formerly the lands were considered belonging to the serfs, or else, to take a better known example, when the Commune of 1871 decided to pay members of the Commune Council 1260 a day, while the federates on the ramparts received only 1s. 3d, this decision was hailed as an act of superior democratic equality. In reality, the Commune only ratified the former inequality between functionary and soldier, government and governed. Coming from an opportunist chamber of deputies, such a decision would have appeared admirable, but the Commune doomed her revolutionary principles because she failed to put them into practice under our existing social system. When a minister gets paid £4,000 a year, while a workman must content himself with £40 or less, when a foreman is paid 2 or 3 times more than a workman, and among workmen there is every gradation, from 8s a day down to the peasant girl's 3d. We disapprove of the high salary of the minister, as well as of the difference between the 8s of the workman and the 3d of the poor woman, and we say, down with the privileges of education, as well as with those of birth. We are anarchists precisely because these privileges revolt us. They revolt us already in this authoritarian society. Could we endure them in a society that began by proclaiming equality? That is why some collectivists, understanding the impossibility of maintaining a scale of wages in a society inspired by the breath of the revolution, hasten to proclaim equality of wage. But they meet with new difficulties, and their equality of wages becomes the same unrealizable utopia as the scale of wages of other collectivists, a society having taken possession of all social wealth. Having boldly proclaimed the right of all to this wealth, whatever share they may have taken in producing it will be compelled to abandon any system of wages, whether in currency or labor notes, the collectivists say, to each according to his deeds, or in other terms, according to his share of services rendered to society. They think it expedient to put this principle into practice as soon as the social revolution will have made all instruments of production common property. But we think that if the social revolution had the misfortune of proclaiming such a principle, it would mean its necessary failure. It would mean leaving the social problem, which past centuries have burdened us with, unsolved. In fact, in a society like ours, in which the more a man works the less he is remunerated, this principle, at first sight, may appear to be a yearning for justice, but it is really only the perpetuation of past injustice. It was by virtue of this principle that wagedom began, turned in the glaring inequalities and all the abominations of present society, because, from the moment work done was appraised in currency or in any other form of wage, the day it was agreed upon that man would only receive the wage he could secure to himself, the whole history of state-aided capitalist society was as good as written. It germinated in this principle. Shall we then return to our starting point and go through the same evolution again? Our theorists desire it, but fortunately it is impossible. The revolution will be communist. If not, it will be drowned in blood, and have to be begun over again. Services rendered to society, be they work in factory or field, or mental services, cannot be valued in money. There can be no exact measure of value of what has been wrongly termed exchange value, nor of use value, with regard to production. If 2 individuals work for the community 5 hours a day, year in year out, at different work which is equally agreeable to them, we may say that on the whole their labor is equivalent, but we cannot divide their work, and say that the result of any particular day, hour, or minute of work of the one is worth the result of a minute or hour of the other. We may roughly say that the man who during his lifetime has deprived himself of leisure during 10 hours a day has given far more to society than the one who has only deprived himself of leisure during 5 hours a day, or who has not deprived himself at all. But we cannot take what he has done during 2 hours and say that the yield is worth twice as much as the yield of another individual, working only 1 hour, and remunerate him in proportion. It would be disregarding all that is complex in industry, in agriculture, in the whole life of present society. It would be ignoring to what extent all individual work is the result of past and present labor of society as a whole. It would mean believing ourselves to be living in the Stone Age, whereas we are living in an age of steel. If you enter a coal mine, you will see a man in charge of a huge machine that raises and lowers a cage. In his hand he holds a lever that stops and reverses the course of the machine. He lowers it and the cage turns back in the twinkling of an eye. He raises it. He lowers it again with a giddy swiftness. All attention, he follows with his eyes fixed on the wall, an indicator that shows him, on a small scale, at which point of the shaft the cage is at each second of its progress. As soon as the indicator has reached a certain level, he suddenly stops the course of the cage, not a yard higher nor lower than the required spot. And no sooner have the colliers unloaded their coal wagon, and pushed empty ones instead, than he reverses the lever and again sends the cage back into space. During 8 or 10 consecutive hours, he must pay the closest attention. Should his brain relax for a moment, the cage would inevitably strike against a gear, break its wheels, snap the rope, crush men, and obstruct work in the mine. Should he waste 3 seconds at each touch of the lever, in our modern perfected mines, the extraction would be reduced from 20 to 15 tons a day. Is it he who is of greatest use in the mine? Or is it perhaps the boy who signals to him from below to raise the cage? Is it the miner at the bottom of the shaft who risks his life every instant, and who will someday be killed by fire damp? Or is it the engineer, who would lose the layer of coal, and would cause the miners to dig on rock by a simple mistake in his calculations? And lastly, is it the mine owner who has put all his capital into the mine, and who has perhaps, contrary to expert advice, asserted that excellent coal would be found there? All the miners engaged in this mine contribute to the extraction of coal in proportion to their strength, their energy, their knowledge, their intelligence, and their skill. And we may say that all have the right to live, to satisfy their needs, and even their whims, when the necessaries of life have been secured for all. But how can we appraise their work? And moreover, is the coal they have extracted their work? Is it not also the work of men who have built the railway leading to the mine and the roads that radiate from all its stations? Is it not also the work of those that have tilled and sown the fields, extracted iron, cut wood in the forests, built the machines that burn coal, and so on? No distinction can be drawn between the work of each man. Measuring the work by its results leads us to absurdity. Dividing and measuring them by hours spent on the work also leads us to absurdity. One thing remains: put the needs above the works, and first of all recognize the right to live, and later on, to the comforts of life. For all those who take their share in production, but take any other branch of human activity, take the manifestations of life as a whole. Which one of us can claim the higher remuneration for his work? Is it the doctor who has found out the illness, or the nurse who has brought about recovery by her hygienic care? Is it the inventor of the first steam engine, or the boy, who, one day getting tired of pulling the rope that formerly opened the valve to let steam enter under the piston, tied the rope to the lever of the machine, without suspecting that he had invented the essential mechanical part of all modern machinery, the automatic valve? Is it the inventor of the locomotive, or the workman of Newcastle, who suggested replacing the stones formerly laid under the rails by wooden sleepers, as the stones, for want of elasticity, caused the trains to derail? Is it the engineer on the locomotive, the signalman who can stop trains, the switchman who transfers a train from one line to another? To whom do we owe the transatlantic cable? Is it to the engineer who obstinately affirmed that the cable would transmit messages when learned electricians declared it to be impossible? Is it to Maury, the scientist, who advised that thick cables should be set aside for others as thin as canes? Or else to those volunteers, come from nobody knows where, who spent their days and nights on deck minutely examining every yard of the cable, and removed the nails that the stockholders of steamship companies stupidly caused to be driven into the non-conducting wrapper of the cable, so as to make it unserviceable, and in a wider sphere, the true sphere of life, with its joys, its sufferings, and its accidents, cannot each one of us recall someone who has rendered him so great a service that we should be indignant if its equivalent in coin were mentioned? The service may have been but a word, nothing but a word spoken at the right time, or else it may have been months and years of devotion. And are we going to appraise these incalculable services in labor not essel? The works of each, but human society would not exist for more than 2 consecutive generations if every one did not give infinitely more than that for which he is paid in coin, in checks, or in civic rewards. The race would soon become extinct if mothers did not sacrifice their lives to take care of their children, if men did not give all the time, without demanding an equivalent, if men did not give just to those from whom they expect no reward, if middle-class society is decaying, if we have got into blind alley from which we cannot emerge without attacking past institutions with torch and hatchet. It is precisely because we have calculated too much. It is because we have let ourselves be influenced into giving only to receive. It is because we have aimed at turning society into a commercial company based on debit and credit. Collectivists know this. They vaguely understand that a society could not exist if it carried out the principle of each according to his deeds. They have a notion that necessaries, we do not speak of whims, the needs of the individual, do not always correspond to his works. Thus the Keeb tells us, the principle, the eminently individualist principle, would, however, be tempered by social intervention, for the education of children and young persons, including maintenance and lodging, and by the social organization for assisting the infirm and the sick, for retreats for aged workers, etc. They understand that a man of 40, father of 3 children, has other needs than young men of 20. They know that the woman who suckles her infant and spends sleepless nights at its bedside cannot do as much work as the man who has slept peacefully. They seem to take in that men and women, worn out maybe by dint of overwork for society, may be incapable of doing as much work as those who have spent their time leisurely and pocketed their labor. Notes in the privileged career of state functionaries, they are eager to temper their principle. They say, society will not fail to maintain and bring up its children, to help both aged and infirm. Without doubt needs will be the measure of the cost that society will burden itself with, to temper the principle of deeds. Charity, charity, always Christian charity, organized by the state this time. They believe in improving asylums for foundlings, in effecting old age and sick insurances so as to temper their principle. But they cannot yet throw aside the idea of wounding first and healing afterwards. 11. Thus, after having denied communism, after having laughed at their ease at the formula to each, according to his needs, these great economists discovered that they have forgotten something, the needs of the producers, which they now admit. Only it is for the state to estimate them, for the state to verify if the needs are not disproportionate to the work. The state will dole out charity. Thence to the English poor law and the workhouse is but a step, there is but a degree, because even this stepmother of a society against whom we are in revolt has also been compelled to temper her individualist principles. She, too, has had to make concessions in a communist direction, and under the same form of charity, she, too, distributes halfpenny dinners to prevent the pillaging of her shops, builds hospitals, often very bad ones, though sometimes splendid ones, to prevent the ravages of contagious diseases. She, too, after having paid the hours of labor, shelters the children of those she has wrecked. She takes their needs into consideration and doles out charity. Poverty, we have said elsewhere, was the primary cause of wealth. It was poverty that created the first capitalist, because before accumulating surplus value of which we hear so much, men had to be sufficiently destitute to consent to sell their labor, so as not to die of hunger. It was poverty that made capitalists, and if the number of poor rapidly increased during the Middle Ages, it was due to the invasions and wars that followed, the founding of states, and to the increase of riches resulting from the exploitation of the East, that tore the bonds asunder which once united agrarian and urban communities, and taught them to proclaim the principle of wages, so dear to exploiters, instead of the solidarity they formerly practiced, and it is this principle that is to spring from a revolution which men dare to call by the name of social revolution, a name so clear to the starved, the oppressed, and the sufferers? It can never be. For the day on which old institutions will fall under the proletarian axe, voices will cry out, bread, shelter, ease for all, and those voices will be listened to. The people will say, let us begin by allaying our thirst for life, for happiness, for liberty, that we have never quenched. And when we shall have tasted of this joy, we will set to work to demolish the last vestiges of middle-class rule, its morality drawn from account books, its debit and credit philosophy, its mine and yours institutions. In demolishing we shall build, as Proudhon said, and we shall build in the name of communism and anarchy. Chapter 14, Consumption and Production, looking at society and its political organization from a different standpoint than that of authoritarian schools, for we start from a free individual to reach a free society. Instead of beginning by the state to come down to the individual, we follow the same method in economic questions. We study the needs of individuals and the means by which they satisfy them before discussing production, exchange, taxation, government, etc. To begin with, the difference may appear trifling, but in reality it upsets official political economy. If you open the works of any economist, you will find that he begins with production, the analysis of means employed nowadays for the creation of wealth, division of labor, manufacture, machinery, accumulation of capital. From Adam Smith to Marx, all have proceeded along these lines. Only in the latter parts of their books do they treat of consumption, that is to say, of the means necessary to satisfy the needs of individuals, and moreover, they confine themselves to explaining how riches are divided among those who vie with one another for their possession. Perhaps you will say this is logical. Before satisfying needs you must create the wherewithal to satisfy them, but before producing anything, must you not feel the need of it? Is it not necessity that first drove men to hunt, to raise cattle, to cultivate land, to make implements, and later on to invent machinery? Is it not the study of needs that should govern production? It would therefore be quite as logical to begin by considering needs and afterwards to discuss the means of production in order to satisfy these needs. This is precisely what we mean to do. But as soon as we look at it from this point of view, political economy entirely changes its aspect. It ceases to be a simple description of facts and becomes a science. We can define it as the study of the needs of humanity and the means of satisfying them with the least possible waste of human energy. Its true name should be physiology of society. It constitutes a parallel science to the physiology of plants and animals, which also is the study of the needs of plants and animals, and the most advantageous ways of satisfying them, in the series of social sciences. The economy of human societies takes the place, occupied in the series of biological sciences by the physiology of organic bodies. We say, here are human beings, united in his society. All feel the need of living in healthy houses. The savage's hut no longer satisfies them. They require a more or less comfortable solid shelter. The question is, then, man's capacity for production being given, can every man have a house of his own? And what is hindering him from having it? And we are soon convinced that every family in Europe could perfectly well have a comfortable house, such as are built in England, in Belgium, or in Pullman City, or else an equivalent set of rooms. A certain number of days' work would suffice to build a pretty little airy house, well fitted up and lighted by gas, but 9/10 of Europeans have never possessed a healthy house, because at all times common people have had to work day after day to satisfy the needs of their rulers, and have never had the necessary leisure or money to build, or to have built, the home of their dreams. And they can have no houses, and will inhabit hovels as long as present conditions remain unchanged. As you see, we proceed contrary to economists, who immortalize the so-called laws of production, and reckoning up the number of houses built every year, demonstrate by statistics, that the new built house is not sufficing to meet all demands. 9/10 of Europeans must live in hovels. Let us pass on to food. After having enumerated the benefits accruing from the division of labor, economists tell us the division of labor requires that some men should work at agriculture and others at manufacture. Farmers producing so much, factories so much, exchange being carried on in such a way they analyze the sale, the profit, the net gain or the surplus value, the wages, the taxes, banking, and so on. But after having followed them so far, we are none the wiser, and if we ask them, how is it that millions of human beings are in want of bread, when every family could grow sufficient wheat to feed 10, 20, and even 100 people annually? They answer us by droning the same anthem: division of labor, wages, surplus value, capital, etc., arriving at the same conclusion, that production is insufficient to satisfy all needs, a conclusion which, if true, does not answer the question, can or cannot man by his labor produce the bread he needs? And if he cannot, what is hindering here are 350 million Europeans. They need so much bread, so much meat, wine, milk, eggs, and butter every year. They need so many houses, so much clothing. This is the minimum of their needs. Can they produce all this? And if they can, will there then be left sufficient leisure for art, science, and amusement? In a word, for everything that is not comprised in the category of absolute necessities? If the answer is in the affirmative, what hinders them going ahead? What must they do to remove obstacles? Is time needed? Let them take it. But let us not lose sight of the aim of production, the satisfaction of needs. If the most imperious needs of men remain unsatisfied, what must he do to increase the productivity of his work? And is there no other cause? Might it not be that production, having lost sight of the needs of men, has strayed in an absolutely wrong direction, and that its organization is at fault? And as we can prove that such is the case, let us see how to reorganize production so as to really satisfy all needs. This seems to us the only right way of facing things, the only way that would allow of political economy becoming a science, the science of social physiology. It is evident that when this science will treat of production, as it is at present carried on by civilized nations, by Hindu communes, or by savages, it will hardly state facts otherwise than the economists state them now, that is to say as a simple descriptive chapter, analogous to descriptive chapters of zoology and botany. But if this chapter were written to throw light on the economy of energy, necessary to satisfy human needs, the chapter would gain in precision, as well as in descriptive value. It would clearly prove the frightful waste of human energy under the present system, and would admit, as we do, that as long as this system exists, the needs of humanity will never be satisfied. The point of view, we see, would be entirely changed. Behind the loom that weaves so many yards of cloth, behind the steel plate perforator, and behind the safe in which dividends are hoarded, we should see man, the artisan of production, more often than not excluded from the feast he has prepared for others. We should also understand that the standpoint being wrong, so-called laws of value and exchange are but a very false explanation of events, as they happen nowadays, and that things will come to pass very differently when production is organized in such a manner as to meet all needs of society. There is not one single principle of political economy that does not change its aspect if you look at it from our point of view. Take, for instance, overproduction, the word which every day re-echoes in our ears. Is there a single economist, academician, or candidate for academical honors, who has not supported arguments, proving that economic crises are due to overproduction, that at a given moment more cotton, more cloth, more watches are produced than are needed? Have not men accused of rapacity the capitalists, who are obstinately bent on producing more than can possibly be consumed? But on careful examination all these reasonings prove unsound. In fact, is there a commodity among those in universal use which is produced in greater quantity than need be? Examine one by one all commodities sent out by countries exporting on a large scale, and you will see that nearly all are produced in insufficient quantities for the inhabitants of the countries exporting them. It is not a surplus of wheat that the Russian peasant sends to Europe. The most plentiful harvest of wheat and rye in European Russia only yield enough for the population, And as a rule, the peasant deprives himself of what he actually needs when he sells his wheat outright to pay rent and taxes. It is not a surplus of coal that England sends to the four corners of the globe, because only 3/4 of a ton per head of population annually remain for home domestic consumption, and millions of Englishmen are deprived of fire in the winter, or have only just enough to boil a few vegetables. In fact, setting aside useless luxuries, there is in England, which exports more than any other country, but a single commodity in universal use, cottons whose production is sufficiently great to perhaps exceed the needs of the community. Yet when we look upon the rags that pass for wearing apparel worn by over a third of the inhabitants of the United Kingdom, we are led to ask ourselves whether the cottons exported would not, within a trifle, suit the real needs of the population. As a rule, it is not a surplus that is exported, though it may have been so originally. The fable of the barefooted shoemaker is as true of nations as it was formerly of artisans. We export the necessary commodities, and we do so because the workmen cannot buy with their wages what they have produced and pay besides the rent and interest to the capitalist and the banker. Not only does the ever-growing need of comfort remain unsatisfied, but strict necessaries are often wanting. Surplus production does, therefore, not exist, at least not in the sense which is given to it by the theorist of political economy. Taking another point, there is a well-proved law. Man produces more than he consumes after he has lived on the proceeds of his toil. There remains a surplus. Thus, a family of cultivators produces enough to feed several families, and so forth. All economists tell us that for us, this oft-repeated sentence has no sense. If it meant that each generation leaves something to future generations, it would be true. Thus, for example, a farmer plants a tree that will live, maybe, for 30, 40, or 100 years, and whose fruits will still be gathered by the farmer's grandchildren. Or he clears a few acres of virgin soil, and we say that the heritage of future generations has been increased by that much. Roads, bridges, canals, his house and his furniture are so much wealth bequeathed to succeeding generations, but this is not what is meant. We are told that the cultivator produces more than he need consume. Rather should they say that, the state having always taken from him a large share of his produce for taxes, the priest for tithe, and the landlord for rent, a whole class of men has been created, who formerly consumed what they produced save what was set aside for unforeseen accidents, or expenses incurred in afforestation, roads etc., but who today are compelled to live very poorly, from hand to mouth, the remainder having been taken from them by the state, the landlord, the priest, and the usurer. Let us also observe that if the needs of the individual are our starting point, we cannot fail to reach communism, an organization which enables us to satisfy all needs in the most thorough and economical way. While if we start from our present method of production, and aim at gain and surplus value, without taking into account if production corresponds to the satisfaction of needs, we necessarily arrive at capitalism, or at most at collectivism, both being but diverse forms of our wages system. In fact, when we consider the needs of the individual and of society, and the means which man has resorted to in order to satisfy them during his varied phases of development, we are convinced of the necessity of systematizing our efforts, instead of producing haphazard as we do nowadays. It grows evident that the appropriation by a few of all rich is not consumed and transmitted from one generation to another is not in the general interest. We can state as a fact that owing to these methods the needs of 3/4 of society are not satisfied, and that the present waste of human strength is the more useless and the more criminal. We discovered, moreover, that the most advantageous use of all commodities would be, for each of them, to go first for satisfying those needs which are the most pressing. That, in other words, the so-called value and use of a commodity does not depend on a simple whim, as has often been affirmed, but on the satisfaction it brings to real needs. Communism, that is to say, an organization which would correspond to a view of consumption, production, and exchange taken as the whole, therefore becomes the logical consequence of the comprehension of things, the only one, in our opinion, that is really scientific, a society that will satisfy the needs of all, and which will know how to organize production, will also have to make a clean sweep of several prejudices concerning industry, and first of all of the theory often preached by economists, the division of labor theory, which we are going to discuss in the next chapter. Chapter 15. The division of labor. Political economy has always confined itself to stating facts occurring in society, and justifying them in the interest of the dominant class. Thus it is in favor of the division of labor created by industry. Having found it profitable to capitalists, it has set it up as a principle. Look at the village smith, said Adam Smith, the father of modern political economy. If he has never been accustomed to making nails, he will only succeed by hard toil in forging 200 to 300 a day, and even then they will be bad. But if this same smith has never done anything but nails, he will easily supply as many as 2,300 in the course of a day. And Smith hastened to the conclusion: divide labor, specialize, Go on specializing. Let us have smiths who only know how to make heads or points of nails, and by this means we shall produce more. We shall grow rich. That a smith sentenced for life to the making of heads of nails would lose all interest in his work, would be entirely at the mercy of his employer with his limited handicraft, would be out of work 4 months out of 12, and that his wages would decrease when he could be easily replaced by an apprentice. Smith did not think of it when he exclaimed, "Long live the division of labor. This is the real gold mine that will enrich the nation." 11 and all joined in the cry, and later on, when a Sismondi or a J.B. Say began to understand that the division of labor, instead of enriching the whole nation, only enriches the rich, and that the worker, who for life is doomed to making the 18th part of a pin, grows stupid and sinks into poverty. What did official economists propose? Nothing. They did not say to themselves that by a lifelong grin at one and the same mechanical toil the worker would lose his intelligence and his spirit of invention, and that, on the contrary, a variety of occupations would result in considerably augmenting the productivity of a nation. But this is the very issue now before us. If, however, only economists preach the permanent and often hereditary division of labor, we might allow them to preach it as much as they pleased. But ideas taught by doctors of science filter into men's minds and pervert them, and from repeatedly hearing the division of labor, profits, interest, credit, etc. spoken of as problems long since solved, men and workers too. And by arguing like economists and by venerating the same fetishes, thus we see a number of socialists, even those who have not feared to point out the mistakes of science, justifying the division of labor. Talk to them about the organization of work during the revolution, and they answer that the division of labor must be maintained, that if you sharpen pins before the revolution you must go on sharpening them after. True, you will not have to work more than 5 hours a day, but you will have to sharpen pins all your life, while others will make designs for machines that will enable you to sharpen hundreds of millions of pins during your lifetime. And others again will be specialists in the higher branches of literature, science, and art, etc. You were born to sharpen pins while Pasteur was born to invent the inoculation against anthrax, and the revolution will leave you both to your respective employments. Well, it is this horrible principle, so noxious to society, so brutalizing to the individual, source of so much harm, that we propose to discuss in its divers manifestations. We know the consequences of the division of labor full well. It is evident that we are divided into two classes. On the one hand, producers who consume very little and are exempt from thinking because they only do physical work, and who work badly because their brains remain inactive, and on the other hand, the consumers who, producing little or hardly anything, have the privilege of thinking for the others, and who think badly because the whole world of those who toil with their hands is unknown to them. The laborers of the soil know nothing of machinery. Those who work at machinery ignore everything about agriculture. The ideal of modern industry is a child tending a machine that he cannot and must not understand, and a foreman who finds him if his attention flags for a moment. The ideal of industrial agriculture is to do away with the agricultural laborer altogether, and to set a man who does odd jobs to tend a steam plow or a threshing machine. The division of labor means labeling and stamping men for life, some to splice ropes in factories, some to be foremen in a business, others to shove huge coal baskets in a particular part of a mine, but none of them to have any idea of machinery as a whole, nor of business, nor of mines. And thereby they destroy the love of work and the capacity for invention that, at the beginning of modern industry, created the machinery on which we pride ourselves so much. What they have done for individuals, they also wanted to do for nations. Humanity was to be divided into national workshops, having each its speciality. Russia, we were taught, was destined by nature to grow corn, England to spin cotton, Belgium to weave cloth, while Switzerland was to train nurses and governesses. Moreover, each separate city was to establish a speciality. Lyon was to weave silk, Auvergne to make lace, and Paris fancy articles. Economists believed that specialization opened an immense field for production and consumption, and that an era of limitless wealth for mankind was at hand. But these great hopes vanished as fast as technical knowledge spread abroad. As long as England stood alone as a weaver of cotton, and as a metalworker on a large scale, as long as only Paris made artistic fancy articles, etc., all went well. Economists could preach so-called division of labor without being refuted, but a new current of thought induced all civilized nations to manufacture for themselves. They found it advantageous to produce what they formerly received from other countries, or from their colonies, which in their turn aimed at emancipating themselves from the mother country. Scientific discoveries universalized the methods of production, and henceforth it was useless to pay an exorbitant price abroad for what could easily be produced at home. Does not then this industrial revolution strike a crushing blow at the theory of the division of labor, which was supposed to be so sound? Chapter 16. The decentralization of industry after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain all but succeeded in ruining the main industries which had sprung up in France at the end of the preceding century. She became also mistress of the seas and had no rivals of importance. She took in the situation and knew how to turn its privileges and advantages to account. She established an industrial monopoly, and imposing upon her neighbors her prices for the goods she alone could manufacture, accumulated riches upon riches. But as the middle-class revolution of the 18th century abolished serfdom and created a proletariat in France, industry, hampered for a time in its flight, soared again. And from the second half of the 19th century France ceased to be a tributary of England for manufactured goods. Today she too has grown into a nation with an export trade. She sells far more than £60 million worth of manufactured goods, and two-thirds of these goods are fabrics. The number of Frenchmen working for export or living by their foreign trade is estimated at 3 millions. France is therefore no longer England's tributary. In her turn she has striven to monopolize certain branches of foreign industry, such as silks and ready-made clothes, and has reaped immense profits therefrom, but she is on the point of losing this monopoly forever, as England is on the point of losing the monopoly of cotton goods. Traveling eastwards, industry has reached Germany. 50 years ago Germany was a tributary of England and France for most manufactured commodities in the higher branches of industry. It is no longer so in the course of the last 45 years, and especially since the Franco-German War, Germany has completely reorganized her industry. The new factories are stocked with the best machinery. The latest creations of industrial art in cotton goods from Manchester, or in silks from Lyon, etc., are now realized in recent German factories. It took 2 or 3 generations of workers at Lyon and Manchester to construct the modern machinery, but Germany adopted it in its perfected state. Technical schools, adapted to the needs of industry, supply the factories with an army of intelligent workmen, practical engineers, who can work with hand and brain. German industry starts at the point which was only reached by Manchester and Lyon after 50 years of groping in the dark of exertion and experiments. It follows that as Germany manufactures as well at home, she diminishes her imports from France and England year by year. She has not only become their rival in manufactured goods in Asia and in Africa, but also in London and in Paris. Short-sighted people may cry out against the Frankfurt Treaty. They may explain German competition by little differences in railway tariffs. They may linger on the petty side of questions and neglect great historical facts. But it is nonetheless certain that the main industries, formerly in the hands of England and France, have progressed eastward, and in Germany they found a country, young, full of energy, possessing an intelligent middle class, and eager in its turn to enrich itself by foreign trade. While Germany freed itself from subjection to France and England, manufactured her own cotton cloth, constructed her own machines, in fact, manufactured all commodities. The main industries took also root in Russia, where the development of manufacture is the more surprising as it sprang up but yesterday. At the time of the abolition of serfdom in 1861, Russia hardly had any factories. Everything they needed, machines, rails, railway engines, rich materials, came from the West. 20 years later she possessed already 85,000 factories, and the goods from these factories had increased fourfold in value. The old machinery was superseded, and now nearly all the steel in use in Russia, 3/4 of the iron, 2/3 of the coal, all railway engines, railway carriages, rails, nearly all steamers, are made in Russia. Russia, destined, so wrote economists, to remain an agricultural territory, has rapidly developed into a manufacturing country. She orders hardly anything from England, and very little from Germany. Economists hold the customs responsible for these facts, and yet cottons manufactured in Russia are sold at the same price as in London. Capital taking no cognizance of fatherland. German and English capitalists, accompanied by engineers and foremen of their own nationalities, have introduced in Russia and in Poland manufactories, the excellence of whose goods compete with the best from England. If customs were abolished tomorrow, manufacture would only gain by it. Not long ago the British manufacturers delivered another hard blow to the imports of cloth and woolens from the West. They set up in southern and middle Russia immense wool factories, stocked with the most perfect machinery from Bradford. And already now Russia hardly imports more than a few pieces of English cloth and French woolen fabrics as samples. The main industries not only move eastward, they are spreading to the southern peninsulas. The Turin exhibition of 1884 has already shown the progress made in Italian manufactured produce, and, let us not make any mistake about it, the mutual hatred of the French and Italian middle classes has no other origin than their industrial rivalry. Spain is also becoming an industrial country, while in the east, Bohemia has suddenly sprung up to importance as a new center of manufactures, provided with perfected machinery and applying the best scientific methods. We might also mention Hungary's rapid progress in the main industries, but let us rather take Brazil as an example. Economists sentence Brazil to cultivate cotton forever, to export it in its raw state, and to receive cotton cloth from Europe in exchange. In fact, 40 years ago Brazil had only 9 wretched little cotton factories with 385 spindles. Today there are 108 cotton mills, possessing 715,000 spindles and 26,050 looms, which throw 234 million yards of textiles on the market annually. Even Mexico is setting about manufacturing cotton cloth, instead of importing it from Europe. As to the United States, they have quite freed themselves from European tutelage, and have triumphantly developed their manufacturing powers, but it was India which gave the most striking proof against the specialization of national industry. We all know the theory. The great European nations need colonies. For colonies send raw material, cotton fiber, unwashed wool, spices, etc., to the motherland. And the motherland, under pretense of sending them manufactured wares, gets rid of her burnt stuffs, her machine scrap, iron, and everything which she no longer has use for. It costs her little or nothing, and nonetheless the articles are sold at exorbitant prices. Such was the theory, such was the practice for a long time. In London and Manchester fortunes were made while India was being ruined. In the India Museum in London, unheard of riches, collected in Calcutta and Bombay by English merchants, are to be seen, but other English merchants and capitalists conceived the very simple idea that it would be more expedient to exploit the natives of India by making cotton cloth in India itself, than to import from 20 to 24 million pounds worth of goods annually. At first a series of experiments ended in failure. Indian weavers, artists, and experts in their own could not inure themselves to factory life. The machinery sent from Liverpool was bad. The climate had to be taken into account, and merchants had to adapt themselves to new conditions, now fully observed. Before British India could become the menacing rival of the motherland she is today, she now possesses 200 cotton factories which employ about 196,400 workmen, and contain 5,231,000 spindles and 48,400 looms, and 38 jute mills, with 409,000 spindles. She exports annually to China, to the Dutch Indies, and to Africa, nearly 8 million pounds worth of the same white cotton cloth, said to be England's speciality. And while English workmen are unemployed and in great want, Indian women weave cotton by machinery for the Far East at the rate of craft, 6pence a day. In short, intelligent manufacturers are fully aware that the day is not far off when they will not know what to do with the factory hands who formerly weave cotton cloth exported from England. Besides which, it is becoming more and more evident that India will not import a single ton of iron from England. The initial difficulties in using the coal and the iron ore obtained in India have been overcome, and foundries, rivaling those in England, have been built on the shores of the Indian Ocean, colonies competing with the motherland in its production of manufactured goods. Such is the factor which will regulate economy in the 20th century. And why should India not manufacture? What should be the hindrance? Capital? But capital goes wherever there are men, poor enough to be exploited. Knowledge. But knowledge recognizes no national barriers. Technical skill of the worker? No are, then. Hindu workmen inferior to the 237,000 boys and girls, not 18 years old, at present working in the English textile factories. After having glanced at national industries, it would be very interesting to turn to special industries. Let us take silk, for example, an eminently French product in the first half of the 19th century. We all know how Lyon became the emporium of the silk trade. At first raw silk was gathered in southern France, till little by little they ordered it from Italy, from Spain, from Austria, from the Caucasus, and from Japan, for the manufacture of their silk fabrics. In 1875, out of 5 million kilos of raw silk converted into stuffs in the vicinity of Lyon, there were only 400,000 kilos of French silk. But if Lyon manufactured imported silk, why should not Switzerland, Germany, Russia, do as much? Silk weaving developed indeed in the villages round Zurich. Bale became a great center of the silk trade. The Caucasian administration engaged women from Marseille and workmen from Lyon to teach Georgians the perfected rearing of silkworms, and the art of converting silk into fabrics to the Caucasian peasants. Austria followed, then Germany. With the help of Lyon workmen, built great silk factories. The United States did likewise in Paterson. And today the silk trade is no longer a French monopoly. Silks are made in Germany and Austria, in the United States, and in England. In winter, Caucasian peasants weave silk handkerchiefs at a wage that would mean starvation to the silk weavers of Lyon. Italy sent silks to France, and Lyon, which in 18,704 exported 460 million francs worth of silk fabrics, exports now only one half of that amount. In fact, the time is not far off when Lyon will only send higher class goods and a few novelties as patterns to Germany, Russia, and Japan. And so it is in all industries. Belgium has no longer the cloth monopoly. Cloth is made in Germany, in Russia, in Austria, in the United States. Switzerland and the French Jura have no longer a clockwork monopoly. Watches are made everywhere. Scotland no longer refines sugar for Russia. Russian sugar is imported into England. Italy, although neither possessing coal nor iron, makes its own ironclads and engines for her steamers. Chemical industry is no longer an English monopoly. Sulfuric acid and soda are made even in the Urals. Steam engines, made at Winterthur, have acquired everywhere a wide reputation, and at the present moment, Switzerland, that has neither coal nor iron nothing but excellent technical schools, makes machinery better and cheaper than England. So ends the theory of exchange, the tendency of trade. As for all else, is toward decentralization. Every nation finds it advantageous to combine agriculture with the greatest possible variety of foundries and manufactories. The specialization of which economists spoke so highly enriched a number of capitalists, but is now of no use. On the contrary, it is to the advantage of every region, every nation, to grow their own wheat, their own vegetables, and to manufacture all produce they consume at home. This diversity is the surest pledge of the complete development of production by mutual cooperation, and the moving cause of progress. While specialization is a hindrance to progress, agriculture can only prosper in proximity to factories, and no sooner does a single factory appear than an infinite variety of other factories must spring up around, so that, mutually supporting and stimulating one another by their inventions, they increase their productivity. It is foolish indeed to export wheat and import flour, to export wool and import cloth, to export iron and import machinery. Not only because transportation is a waste of time and money, but, above all, because a country with no developed industry inevitably remains behind the times in agriculture. Because a country with no large factories to bring steel to a finished condition is also backward in all other industries. And lastly, because the industrial and technical capacities of the nation remain undeveloped, in the world of production, everything holds together nowadays. Cultivation of the soil is no longer possible without machinery, without great irrigation works, without railways, without manure factories. And to adapt this machinery, these railways, these irrigation engines, etc., to local conditions, a certain spirit of invention, a certain amount of technical skill, that lie dormant as long as spades and plowshares are the only implements of cultivation, must be developed if fields are to be properly cultivated, and are to yield the abundant harvest man has the right to expect. It is essential that workshops, foundries, and factories develop within the reach of the fields. A variety of occupations, a variety of skill arising therefrom and working together for a common aim, these are the genuine forces of progress. And now let us imagine the inhabitants of a city, or a territory whether vast or small, stepping for the first time onto the path of the social revolution. We are sometimes told that nothing will have changed, that the mines, the factories, etc., will be expropriated and proclaimed national or communal property, that every man will go back to his usual work, and that the revolution will then be accomplished. But this is a dream. The social revolution cannot take place so simply. We have already mentioned that should the revolution break out tomorrow in Paris, Lyon, or any other city, should the workers lay hands on factories, houses, and banks, present production would be completely revolutionized by this simple fact: international commerce will come to a standstill. So also will the importation of foreign breadstuffs. The circulation of commodities and of provisions will be paralyzed. And then, the city or territory in revolt will be compelled to provide for itself, and to reorganize production. If it fails to do so, it is death. If it succeeds, it will revolutionize the economic life of the country, the quantity of imported provisions having decreased, consumption having increased. 1 million Parisians working for exportation purposes having been thrown out of work. A great number of things imported today from distant or neighboring countries not reaching their destination. Fancy trade being temporarily at a standstill. What will the inhabitants have to eat 6 months after the revolution? We think that when the stores are empty, the masses will seek to obtain their food from the land. They will be compelled to cultivate the soil, to combine agricultural production with industrial production in Paris and its environs. They will have to abandon the merely ornamental trades, and consider the most urgent need bread. Citizens will be obliged to become agriculturists, not in the same manner as peasants who wear themselves out, plowing for a wage that barely provides them with sufficient food for the year, but by following the principles of market gardeners, intensive agriculture, applied on a large scale by means of the best machinery that man has invented or can invent. They will till the land not, however, like the country beast of burden. For a Paris jeweler would object to that. They will reorganize cultivation, not in 10 years' time, but at once, during the revolutionary struggles, from fear of being worsted by the enemy. Agriculture will have to be carried on by intelligent beings availing themselves of their knowledge, organizing themselves in joyous gangs for pleasant work, like the men who, 100 years ago, worked in the Champ de Mars for the Feast of the Federation and work of delight, when not carried to excess, when scientifically organized. When man invents and improves his tools and is conscious of being a useful member of the community, of course, they will not only cultivate, they will also produce those things which they formerly used to order from foreign parts. And let us not forget that for the inhabitants of a revolted territory, foreign parts may include all districts that have not joined in the revolutionary movement. During the revolutions of 1793 and 1871, Paris was made to feel that foreign parts meant even the country district at her very gates. The speculator in grains at Troyes starved the sans-culottes of Paris more effectually than the German armies brought on French soil by the Versailles conspirators. The revolted city will be compelled to do without foreigners, and why not? France invented beetroot sugar when sugar cane ran short during the Continental blockade. Parisians discovered saltpeter in their cellars when they no longer received any from abroad. Shall we be inferior to our grandfathers, who with difficulty lisped the first words of science? A revolution is more than the destruction of a political system. It implies the awakening of human intelligence, the increasing of the inventive spirit tenfold, hundredfold. It is the dawn of a new science, the science of men like Laplace, Lamarck, Lavoisier. It is a revolution in the minds of men, more than in their institutions, and economists tell us to return to our workshops, as if passing through a revolution, we're going home after a walk in the Epping forest. To begin with, the sole fact of having laid hands on middle-class property implies the necessity of completely reorganizing the whole of economic life in workshops, in dockyards, and in factories, and the revolution will not fail to act in this direction, should Paris, during the social revolution, be cut off from the world for a year or two by the supporters of middle-class rule. Its millions of intellects, not yet depressed by factory life, that city of little trades which stimulate the spirit of invention, will show the world what man's brain can accomplish without asking any help from without, but the motor force of the sun that gives light, the power of the wind that sweeps away impurities, and the silent life forces at work in the earth we tread on. We shall see then what a variety of trades, mutually cooperating on a spot of the globe and animated by the social revolution, can do to feed, clothe, house, and supply with all manner of luxuries millions of intelligent men. We need write no fiction to prove this. What we are sure of, what has already been experimented upon, and recognized as practical, would suffice to carry it into effect, if the attempt were fertilized, vivified by the daring inspiration of the revolution, and the spontaneous impulse of the masses. Chapter 17. Agriculture. Political economy has often been reproached with drawing all its deductions from the decidedly false principle that the only incentive capable of forcing a man to augment his power of production is personal interest in its narrowest sense. The reproach is perfectly true. So true that epochs of great industrial discoveries and true progress in industry are precisely those in which the happiness of all was the aim pursued, and in which personal enrichment was least thought of. Great investigators and great inventors aimed without doubt at the emancipation of mankind. And if Watt, Stevenson, Jacquard, etc., could have only foreseen what a state of misery their sleepless nights would bring to the workers, they would probably have burned their designs and broken their models. Another principle that pervades political economy is just as false. It is the tacit admission, common to all economists, that if there is often overproduction in certain branches, the society will nevertheless never have sufficient products to satisfy the wants of all, and that consequently the day will never come when nobody will be forced to sell his labor in exchange for wages. This tacit admission is found at the basis of all theories and the so-called laws taught by economists, and yet it is certain that the day when any civilized association of individuals would ask itself, what are the needs of all, and the means of satisfying them, it would see that, in industry as in agriculture, it already possesses sufficient to provide abundantly for all needs, on condition that it knows how to apply these means to satisfy real needs. That this is true as regards industry, no one can contest indeed. It suffices to study the processes already in use to extract coals and ore, to obtain steel and work it, to manufacture what is used for clothing, etc., in large industrial establishments. In order to perceive that we could already increase our production fourfold and yet economize work, we go further. We assert that agriculture is in the same position. The laborer, like the manufacturer, already possesses the means to increase his production, not only fourfold but tenfold. And he will be able to put it into practice as soon as he feels the need of it, as soon as the socialist organization of work will be established instead of the present capitalistic one. Each time agriculture is spoken of, men imagine a peasant bending over the plow, throwing badly sorted corn haphazard into the ground and waiting anxiously for what the good or bad season will bring forth. Or a family working from morn to night and reaping as reward a rude bed, dry bread and coarse beverage. In a word, they picture the wild beast of La Bruyere, and for this man, thus subjected to misery, the utmost relief society proposes is to reduce his taxes or his rent. But they do not even dare to imagine a cultivator standing erect, taking leisure, and producing by a few hours' work per day sufficient food to nourish, not only his own family, but 100 men more at the least. In their most glowing dreams of the future, socialists do not go beyond American extensive culture, which, after all, is but the infancy of agricultural art. The agriculturist has broader ideas too. Their conceptions are on a far grander scale. He only asks for a fraction of an acre in order to produce sufficient vegetables for a family, and to feed 25 horned beasts he needs no more space than he formerly required to feed one. His aim is to make his own soil, to defy seasons and climate, to warm both air and earth around the young plant, to produce, in a word, on 1 acre what he used to crop on 50 acres, and that without any excessive fatigue by greatly reducing, on the contrary, the total of former labor. He knows that we will be able to feed everybody by giving to the culture of the fields no more time than what each can give with pleasure and joy. This is the present tendency of agriculture. While scientific men, led by Liebig, the creator of the chemical theory of agriculture, often got on the wrong tack in their love of mere theories, unlettered agriculturists opened up new roads to prosperity. Market gardeners of Paris, Rouen, Scotch and English gardeners, Flemish farmers, peasants of Jersey, Guernsey, and farmers on the Scilly Isles have opened up such large horizons that the mind hesitates to grasp them. While up till lately a family of peasants needed at least 17 to 20 acres to live on the produce of the soil, and we know how peasants live, we can no longer say what is the minimum area on which all that is necessary to a family can be grown, even including articles of luxury, if the soil is worked by means of intensive culture. 10 years ago it could already be asserted that a population of 30 million individuals could live very well without importing anything on what could be grown in Great Britain. But now, when we see the progress recently made in France as well as in England, and when we contemplate the new horizons which open before us, we can say that in cultivating the earth as it is already cultivated in many places, even on poor soils, 50 or 60 million inhabitants to the territory of Great Britain would still be a very feeble proportion to what men could exact from the soil. In any case, as we are about to demonstrate, we may consider it as absolutely proved that if tomorrow Paris and the 2 departments of Seine and of Seine-et-Oise organized themselves as an anarchist commune, in which all worked with their hands, and if the entire universe refused to send them a single bushel of wheat, a single head of cattle, a single basket of fruit, and left them only the territory of the 2 departments, they could not only produce corn, meat, and vegetables necessary for themselves, but also articles of luxury in sufficient quantities for all, and in addition, we affirm that the sum total of this labor would be far less than that expended at present to feed these people with corn harvested in Auvergne and Russia, with vegetables produced a little everywhere by extensive agriculture, and with fruit grown in the south. It is self-evident that we in no wise desire all exchange to be suppressed, nor that each region should strive to produce that which will only grow in its climate by a more or less artificial culture. But we care to draw attention to the fact that the theory of exchange, such as is understood today, is strangely exaggerated, that exchange is often useless and even harmful. We assert, moreover, that people have never had a right conception of the immense labor of southern wine growers, nor of that of Russian and Hungarian corn growers, whose excessive labor could also be very much reduced if they adopted intensive culture, instead of their present system of extensive agriculture. It would be impossible to quote here the mass of facts on which we base our assertions. We are therefore obliged to refer our readers who want further information to another book, Fields, Factories, and Workshops. Above all, we earnestly invite those who are interested in the question to read several excellent works published in France and elsewhere, and of which we give a list at the close of this book. As to the inhabitants of large towns, who have as yet no real notion of what agriculture can be, we advise them to explore the surrounding market gardens and study the cultivation. They need but observe and question market gardeners, and a new world will be open to them. They will thus be able to see what European agriculture may be in the 20th century, and they will understand with what force the social revolution will be armed when we know the secret of taking everything we need from the soil. A few facts will suffice to show that our assertions are in no way exaggerated. We only wish them to be preceded by a few general remarks. We know in what a wretched condition European agriculture is. If the cultivator of the soil is not plundered by the landowner, he is robbed by the state. If the state taxes him moderately, the moneylender enslaves him by means of promissory notes, and soon turns him into the simple tenant of his soil, belonging in reality to a financial company. The landlord, the state, and the banker thus plunder the cultivator by means of rent, taxes, and interest. The sum varies in each country, but it never falls below the quarter, very often the half of the raw produce. In France, agriculturists paid the state quite recently as much as 44% of the gross produce. Moreover, the share of the owner and the state always goes on increasing. As soon as the cultivator has obtained more plentiful crops by prodigies of labor, invention, or initiative, the tribute he will owe to the landowner, the state, and the banker will augment in proportion. If he doubles the number of bushels reaped per acre, rent will be doubled and taxes too, and the state will take care to raise them still more if the prices go up. And so on. In short, everywhere the cultivator of the soil works 12 to 16 hours a day, these three vultures take from him everything he might lay by. They rob him everywhere of what would enable him to improve his culture. This is why agriculture progresses so slowly. The cultivator can only occasionally make some progress, in some exceptional regions under quite exceptional circumstances, following upon a quarrel between the three vampires. And yet we have said nothing about the tribute every cultivator pays to the manufacturer. Every machine, every spade, every barrel of chemical manure is sold to him at 3 or 4 times its real cost. Nor let us forget the middleman, who levies the lion's share of the earth's produce. This is why, during all this century of invention and progress, agriculture has only improved from time to time on very limited areas. Happily there have always been small oases, neglected for some time by the vultures, and here we learn what intensive agriculture can produce for mankind. Let us mention a few examples in the American prairies which, however, only yield meager spring wheat crops from 7 to 15 bushels an acre, and even these are often marred by periodical droughts. 500 men, working only during 8 months, produce the annual food of 50,000 people. With all the improvements of the last few years, one man's yearly labor 1,300 days, yields, delivered in Chicago as flour, the yearly food of 250 men. Here the result is obtained by a great economy in manual labor. On those vast plains, which the eye cannot encompass, plowing, harvesting, thrashing are organized in almost military fashion. There is no useless running to and fro, no laws of time, all is done with parade-like precision. This is agriculture on a large-scale agriculture, which takes the soil from nature without seeking to improve it. When the earth has yielded all it can, they leave it, they seek elsewhere for a virgin soil, to be exhausted in its turn. But there is also intensive agriculture, which has already worked, and will be more and more so, by machinery. Its object is to cultivate a limited space well, to manure, to improve, to concentrate work, and to obtain the largest crop possible. This kind of culture spreads every year, and whereas agriculturists in the south of France and on the fertile plains of Western America are content with an average crop of 11 to 15 bushels per acre by extensive culture, they reap regularly 39, even 55, and sometimes 60 bushels per acre in the north of France. The annual consumption of a man is thus obtained from less than a quarter of an acre, and the more intense the culture is, the less work is expended to obtain a bushel of wheat. Machinery replaces man at the preliminary work and for the improvements needed by the land, such as draining, clearing of stones, which will double the crops in future, once and forever. Sometimes nothing but keeping the soil free of weeds without manuring allows an average soil to yield excellent crops from year to year. It has been done for 20 years in succession at Rothamsted, in Hertfordshire, extensive. Let us not write an agricultural romance, but be satisfied with a crop of 44 bushels per acre. That needs no exceptional soil, but merely a rational culture, and let us see what it means, the 3,600,000 individuals who inhabit the 2 departments of Seine and Seine, was consume yearly for their food a little less than 22 million bushels of cereals, chiefly wheat, and in our hypothesis they would have to cultivate, in order to obtain this crop, 494,200 acres out of the 1,507,300 acres which they possess. It is evident they would not cultivate them with spades. That would need too much time, 96 work days of 5 hours per acre. It would be preferable to improve the soil once for all, to drain what needed to be drained, to level what needed leveling, to clear the soil of stones. Were it even necessary to spend 5 million days of 5 hours in this preparatory work, an average of 10 work days to each acre, then they would plow with the steam digger, which would take 1 3/5 of a day per acre, and they would give another 1 3/5 of a day for working with the double plow. Seeds would be sorted by steam instead of taken haphazard, and they would be carefully sown in rows instead of being thrown to the 4 winds. Now all this work would not take 10 days of 5 hours per acre if the work were done under good conditions. But if 10 million workdays are given to good culture during 3 or 4 years, The result will be later on crops of 44 to 55 bushels per acre by only working half the time. 15 million workdays will have thus been spent to give bread to a population of 3,600,000 inhabitants, and the work would be such that each could do it without having muscles of steel, or without having even worked the ground before. The initiative and the general distribution of work would come from those who know the soil. As to the work itself, there is no townsman of either sex so enfeebled as to be incapable of looking after machines and of contributing his share to agrarian work after a few hours' apprenticeship. Well, when we consider that in the present chaos there are, in a city like Paris, without counting the unemployed of the upper classes, about 100,000 men out of work in their several trades, we see that the power lost in our present organization would alone suffice to give, with a rational culture, bread necessary to the 3 or 4 million inhabitants of the two departments. We repeat, this is no fancy dream, and we have not spoken of the truly intensive agriculture. We have not depended upon the wheat, obtained in 3 years by Mr. Hallett, of which one grain, replanted, produced 5,000 or 6,000, and occasionally 10,000 grains, which would give the wheat necessary for a family of 5 individuals on an area of 120 square yards. On the contrary, we have only mentioned what has been already achieved by numerous farmers in France, England, Belgium, etc., and what might be done tomorrow with the experience and knowledge acquired already by practice on a large scale, but without a revolution, neither tomorrow, nor after tomorrow will see it done, because it is not to the interest of landowners and capitalists, and because peasants who would find their profit in it have neither the knowledge nor the money, nor the time to obtain what is necessary to go ahead. The present society has not yet reached this stage, but let Parisians proclaim an anarchist commune, and they will of necessity come to it, because they will not be foolish enough to continue making luxurious toys, which Vienna, Warsaw, and Berlin make as well already, and to run the risk of being left without bread. Moreover, agricultural work, by the help of machinery, would soon become the most attractive and the most joyful of all occupations. We have had enough jewelry and enough dolls, clothes, they would say. It is high time for the workers to recruit their strength in agriculture, to go in search of vigor, of impressions of nature, of the joy of life, that they have forgotten in the dark factories of the suburbs. In the Middle Ages it was alpine pasture lands, rather than guns, which allowed the Swiss to shake off lords and kings. Modern agriculture will allow a city in revolt to free itself from the combined bourgeois forces. We have seen how the 3.5 million inhabitants of the two departments round Paris could find ample bread by cultivating only a third of their territory. Let us now pass on to cattle. Englishmen, who eat much meat, consume on an average a little less than 220 ib a year per adult. Supposing all meats consumed were oxen, that makes a little less than the third of an ox. An ox a year for 5 individuals including children, is already a sufficient ration. For 3.5 million inhabitants this would make an annual consumption of 700,000 head of cattle. Today, with the pasture system, we need at least 1,000,000 acres to nourish 660,000 head of cattle. This makes 9 acres per each head of horn cattle. Nevertheless, with prairies moderately watered by spring water, as recently done on thousands of acres in the southwest of France, 1.25 million acres already suffice. But if intensive culture is practiced and beetroot is grown for fodder, you only need a quarter of that area, that is to say, about 310,000 acres. And if we have recourse to maize and practice ensilage, the compression of fodder while green, like Arabs, we obtain fodder on an area of 217,500 acres, in the environs of Milan, where sewer water is used to irrigate the fields. Fodder for 2 to 3 horn cattle per each acre is obtained on an area of 22,000 acres, and on a few favored fields, up to 177 tons of hay to the 10 acres have been cropped. The yearly provender of 36 milk cows. Nearly 9 acres per head of cattle are needed under the pasture system, and only 2.5 acres for 9 oxen, or cows under the new system. These are the opposite extremes in modern agriculture. In Guernsey, on a total of 9,884 acres utilized, nearly half, 4,695 acres, are covered with cereals and kitchen gardens. Only 5,189 acres remain as meadows. On these 5,189 acres, 1,480 horses, 7,260 head of cattle, 900 sheep, and 4,200 pigs are fed, which makes more than 3 head of cattle per 2 acres, without reckoning the sheep or the pigs. It is needless to add that the fertility of the soil is made by seaweed and chemical manures. Returning to our 3.5 million inhabitants belonging to Paris and its environs, we see that the land necessary for the rearing of cattle comes down from 5 million acres to 197,000. Well then, let us not stop at the lowest figures, let us take those of ordinary intensive culture. Let us liberally add to the land necessary for smaller cattle, which must replace some of the horned beasts and allow 395,000 acres for the rearing of cattle. 494,000 if you like, on the 1,013,000 acres remaining after bread has been provided for the people. Let us be generous and give 5 million work days to put this land into a productive state, after having therefore employed in the course of a year 20 million work days, half of which are for permanent improvements. We shall have bread and meat assured to us, without including all the extra meat obtainable in the shape of fowls, pigs, rabbits, etc., without taking into consideration that a population provided with excellent vegetables and fruit consumes less meat than Englishmen, who supplement their poor supply of vegetables by animal food. Now, how much do 20 million workdays of 5 hours make per inhabitant? Very little indeed. A population of 3.5 millions must have at least 1,200,000 adult men, and as many women capable of work. Well then, to give bread and meat to all, it would need only 17.5 days of work a year per man. Add 3 million workdays, or double that number if you like, in order to obtain milk. That will make 25 workdays of 5 hours in all, nothing more than a little pleasurable country exercise to obtain the three principal products: bread, meat, and milk. The three products which, after housing, cause daily anxiety to 9/10 of mankind. And yet let us not tire of repeating not fancy dreams. We have only told what these are has been obtained by experience on a large scale. Agriculture could be reorganized in this way tomorrow if property laws and general ignorance did not offer opposition. The day Paris has understood that to know what you eat and how it is produced is a question of public interest. The day when everybody will have understood that this question is infinitely more important than all the parliamentary debates of the present times, on that day the revolution will be an accomplished fact. Paris will take possession of the two departments and cultivate them. And then the Parisian worker, after having labored a third of his existence in order to buy bad and insufficient food, will produce it himself, under his walls, within the enclosure of his forts, if they still exist, in a few hours of healthy and attractive work. And now we pass on to fruit and vegetables. Let us go outside Paris and visit the establishment of a market gardener who accomplishes wonders, ignored by learned economists. At a few miles from the academies, let us visit, suppose in Pons, the author of a work on market gardening, who makes no secret of what the earth yields him, and who has published it all along in Pons, and especially his workmen work like slaves. It takes 8 men to cultivate a plot a little less than 3 acres. They work 12 and even 15 hours a day, that is to say, 3 times more than is needed. 24 of them would not be too many. To which Pons will probably answer that as he pays the terrible sum of £100 rent a year for his 27/10 acres of land, and £100 for manure bought in the barracks, he is obliged to exploit. He would no doubt answer, being exploited, I'll exploit in my turn. His installation has also cost him £1,200, of which certainly more than half went as tribute to the idle barons of industry. In reality, this establishment represents at most 3,000 workdays, probably much less. But let us examine his crops: nearly 10 tons of carrots, nearly 10 tons of onions, radishes, and small vegetables, 6,000 heads of cabbage, 3,000 heads of cauliflower, 5,000 baskets of tomatoes, 5,000 dozen of choice fruit, 154,000 salads. In short, a total of 123 tons of vegetables and fruit to 27/10 acres, 120 yards long by 109 yards broad, which makes more than 44 tons of vegetables to the acre. But a man does not eat more than 660 pounds of vegetables and fruit a year, and 2½ acres of a market garden yield enough vegetables and fruit to richly supply the table of 350 adults during the year. Thus 24 persons employed a whole year in cultivating 27/10 acres of land, and only working 5 hours a day, would produce sufficient vegetables and fruit for 350 adults, which is equivalent at least to 500 individuals. To put it in another way, in cultivating like Pons, and his results have already been surpassed, 350 adults should each give a little more than 100 hours a year to produce vegetables and fruit necessary for 500 people. Let us mention that such a production is not the exception. It takes place under the walls of Paris, on an area of 2,220 acres, by 5,000 market gardeners. Only these market gardeners are reduced nowadays to a state of beast of burden, in order to pay an average rent of £32 per acre. But do not these facts, which can be verified by everyone, prove that 17,300 acres of the 519,000 remaining to us would suffice to give all necessary vegetables, as well as a liberal amount of fruit to the 3.5 millions inhabitants of our 2 departments? As to the quantity of work necessary to produce these fruits and vegetables, it would amount to 50 million workdays of 5 hours 150 days per adult male, if we measure by the market gardener's standard of work, but we could reduce this quantity if we had recourse to the process in vogue in Jersey and Guernsey. We must also remember that the Paris market gardener is forced to work so hard because he mostly produces early season fruits, the high prices of which have to pay for fabulous rents, and that this system of culture entails more work than is really necessary. The market gardeners of Paris, not having the means to make a great outlay on their gardens, and being obliged to pay heavily for glass, wood, iron, and coal, obtain their artificial heat out of manure. While it can be had at much less cost in hothouses, the market gardeners, we say, are forced to become machines and to renounce all joys of life to obtain their marvelous crops. But these hard grinders have rendered a great service to humanity in teaching us that the soil can be made. They make it with old hotbeds of manure, which have already served to give the necessary warmth to young plants and to early fruit, and they make it in such great quantity that they are compelled to sell it in part, otherwise it would raise the level of their gardens by 1 inch every year. They do it so well, so Barral teaches us, in his Dictionary of Agriculture, in an article on market gardeners, that in recent contracts, the market gardener stipulates that he will carry away his soil with him when he leaves the bit of ground he is cultivating. Loam carried away on carts, with furniture and glass frames. That is the answer of practical cultivators to the learned treatises of a Ricardo, who represented rent as a means of equalizing the natural advantages of the soil. The soil is worth what man is worth, that is the gardener's motto. And yet the market gardeners of Paris and Rouen labor 3 times as hard to obtain the same results as their fellow workers in Guernsey or in England. Applying industry to agriculture, these last make their climate in addition to their soil. By means of the greenhouse, 50 years ago the greenhouse was the luxury of the rich. It was kept to grow exotic plants for pleasure. But nowadays its use begins to be generalized. A tremendous industry has grown up lately in Guernsey and Jersey, where hundreds of acres are already covered with glass, to say nothing of the countless small greenhouses kept in every little farm garden. Acres and acres of greenhouses have lately been built also at Worthing, in the suburbs of London, and in several other parts of England and Scotland. They are built of all qualities, beginning with those which have granite walls, down to those which represent mere shelters made in planks and glass frames, which cost, even now, with all the tribute paid to capitalists and middlemen, less than 3s60 per square yard under glass. Most of them are heated for at least 3 or 4 months every year, but even the coal greenhouses, which are not heated at all, give excellent results, of course, not for growing grapes and tropical plants, but for potatoes, carrots, peas, tomatoes, and so on. In this way man emancipates himself from climate, and at the same time he avoids also the heavy work with the hotbeds, and he saves both in buying much less manure and in work. 3 men to the acre, each of them working less than 60 hours a week, grow on very small spaces what formerly required acres and acres of land. The result of all these recent conquests of cultures, that if 1/2 only of the adults of a city gave each about 50 half-days for the culture of the finest fruit and vegetables out of season, they would have all the year round an unlimited supply of that sort of fruit and vegetables for the whole population. But there is a still more important fact to notice. The greenhouse has nowadays a tendency to become a mere kitchen garden under glass. And when it is used to such a purpose, the simplest plank and glass unheated shelters already give fabulous crops, such as, for instance, 500 bushels of potatoes per acre as a first crop ready by the end of April, after which a second and a third crop are obtained in the extremely high temperature which prevails in the summer under glass. I gave in my fields, factories, and workshops most striking facts in this direction. Sufficient to say here that at Jersey, 34 men, with 1 trained gardener only, cultivate 13 acres under glass, from which they obtain 143 tons of fruit and early vegetables, using for this extraordinary culture less than 1,000 tons of coal, and this is done now in Guernsey and Jersey on a very large scale. Quite a number of steamers constantly plying between Guernsey and London, only to export the crops of the greenhouses. Nowadays, in order to obtain that same crop of 500 bushels of potatoes, we must plow every year a surface of 4 acres, plant it, cultivate it, weed it, and so on. Whereas with the glass, even if we shall have to give perhaps, to start with, half a day's work per square yard in order to build the greenhouse, we shall save afterwards at least 1/2, and probably 3/4 of the formerly required yearly labor. These are facts, results which everyone can verify himself, and these facts are already a hint as to what man could obtain from the earth if he treated it with intelligence. In all the above we have reasoned upon what already withstood the test of experience. Intensive culture of the fields, irrigated meadows, the hothouse, and finally the kitchen garden under glass are realities. Moreover, the The tendency is to extend and to generalize these methods of culture, because they allow of obtaining more produce with less work and with more certainty. In fact, after having studied the most simple glass shelters of Guernsey, we affirm that, taking all in all, far less work is expended for obtaining potatoes under glass in April, than in growing them in the open air, which requires digging a space 4 times as large, watering it, weeding it, etc. Work is likewise economized in employing a perfected tool or machine, even when an initial expense had to be incurred to buy the tool. Complete figures concerning the culture of common vegetables under glass are still wanting. This culture is of recent origin, and is only carried out on small areas, but we have already figures concerning the 50-years-old culture of early season grapes, and these figures are conclusive, in the north of England, on the Scotch frontier, where coal only costs 3 as a ton at the pit's mouth. They have long since taken to growing hot of grapes. 30 years ago these grapes, ripe in January, were sold by the grower at 20s per ib and resold at 40s per ib, for Napoleon Hill's table. Today the same grower sells them at only 2 as 60 per ib. He tells us so himself in a horticultural journal. The fall is caused by tons and tons of grapes arriving in January to London and Paris. Thanks to the cheapness of coal and an intelligent culture, grapes from the north travel now southwards, in a contrary direction to ordinary fruit. They cost so little that in May, English and Jersey grapes are sold at 1 as 8d per ib by the gardeners, and yet this price, like that of 40s 30 years ago, is only kept up by slack production. In March, Belgian grapes are sold at from 60 to 8d, while in October, grapes cultivated in immense quantities under glass, and with a little artificial heating in the environs of London are sold at the same price as grapes bought by the pound in the vineyards of Switzerland and the Rhine, that is to say, for a few halfpence. Yet they still cost 2/3 too much, by reason of the excessive rent of the soil and the cost of installation and heating, on which the gardener pays a formidable tribute to the manufacturer and middleman. This being understood, we may say that it costs next to nothing to have delicious grapes under the latitude of, and in our misty London in autumn, in one of the suburbs, for instance, a wretched glass and plaster shelter, 9 feet 10 in long by 6 1/2 foot wide, resting against our cottage, gave us about 50 pounds of grapes of an exquisite taste in October, for 9 consecutive years. The crop came from a Hamburg vine stock, 6 years old, and the shelter was so bad that the rain came through. At night the temperature was always that of outside. It was evidently not heated, for that would be as useless as to heat the street, and the cares to be given were, pruning the vine half an hour every year, and bringing a wheelbarrow full of manure, which is thrown over the stalk of the vine, planted in red clay outside the shelter. On the other hand, if we estimate the amount of care given to the vine on the borders of the Rhine or Lake Leman, the terraces constructed stone upon stone on the slopes of the hills, the transport of manure and also of earth to a height of 200 or 300 feet, we come to the conclusion that on the whole the expenditure of work necessary to cultivate vines is more considerable in Switzerland, or on the banks of the Rhine, than it is under glass in London suburbs. This may seem paradoxical, because it is generally believed that vines grow of themselves in the south of Europe, and that the vine grower's work costs nothing. But gardeners and horticulturists, far from contradicting us, confirm our assertions. The most advantageous culture in England is vine culture, wrote a practical gardener, editor of the English Journal of Horticulture. Prices speak eloquently for themselves, as we know. Translating these facts into communist language, we may assert that the man or woman who takes 20 hours a year from his leisure time to give some little care very pleasant in the main to 2 or 3 vine stalks sheltered by simple glass under any European climate, will gather as many grapes as their family and friends can eat. And that applies not only to vines, but to all fruit trees. The commune that will put the processes of intensive culture into practice on a large scale will have all possible vegetables, indigenous or exotic, and all desirable fruits, without employing more than about 10 hours a year per inhabitant. In fact, nothing would be easier than to verify the above statements by direct experiment. Suppose 100 acres of a light loam, such as we have at Worthing, are transformed into a number of market gardens, each one with its glass houses for the rearing of the seedlings and young plants. Suppose also that 50 more acres are covered with glass houses, and the organization of the whole is left to practical experienced French maraîchers and Guernsey or Worthing greenhouse gardeners, in basing the maintenance of these 150 acres on the Jersey average, requiring the work of 3 men per acre under glass, which makes less than 8,600 hours of work a year. It would need about 1,300 hours for the 150 acres. 50 competent gardeners could give 5 hours a day to this work, and the rest would be simply done by people who, without being gardeners by profession, would soon learn how to use a spade, and to handle the plants. But this work would yield at least, we have seen it in a preceding chapter, all necessaries and articles of luxury in the way of fruit and vegetables. for at least 40,000 or 50,000 people. Let us admit that among this number there are 13,500 adults willing to work at the kitchen garden, then each one would have to give 100 hours a year distributed over the whole year. These hours of work would become hours of recreation spent among friends and children in beautiful gardens. More beautiful probably than those of the legendary Semiramis. This is the balance sheet of the labor to be spent in order to be able to eat to satiety fruit which we are deprived of today, and to have vegetables in abundance, now so scrupulously rationed out by the housewife, when she has to reckon each halfpenny which must go to enrich capitalists and landowners. If only humanity had the consciousness of what it can, and if that consciousness only gave it the power to will, if it only knew that cowardice of the spirit is the rock on which all revolutions have stranded until now, we can easily perceive the new horizons opening before the social revolution. Each time we speak of revolution, the worker who has seen children wanting food lowers his brow and repeats obstinately, "What of bread? Will there be sufficient if everyone eats according to his appetite? What if the peasants, ignorant tools of reaction, starve our towns as the Black Bands did in France in 1793? What shall we do? 11. Let them do their worst. The large cities will have to do without them. At what, then, should the hundreds of thousands of workers, who are asphyxiated today in small workshops and factories, be employed on the day they regain their liberty? Will they continue locking themselves up in factories after the revolution? Will they continue to make luxurious toys for export when they see their stock of corn getting exhausted, meat becoming scarce, and vegetables disappearing without being replaced? Evidently not. They will leave the town and go into the fields, aided by a machinery which will enable the weakest of us to put a shoulder to the wheel. They will carry revolution into previously enslaved cultures. They will have carried it into institutions and ideas. Hundreds of acres will be covered with glass, and men and women with delicate fingers will foster the growth of young plants. Hundreds of other acres will be plowed by steam, improved by manures, or enriched by artificial soil obtained by the pulverization of rocks. Happy crowds of occasional laborers will cover these acres with crops, guided in the work and experiments partly by those who know agriculture, but especially by the great and practical spirit of a people roused from long slumber and illumined by that bright beacon, the happiness of all. And in 2 or 3 months the early crops will relieve the most pressing wants and provide food for a people who, after so many centuries of expectation, will at last be able to appease their hunger and eat according to their appetite. In the meanwhile, popular genius, the genius of a nation which revolts and knows its wants, will work at experimenting with new processes of culture that we already catch a glimpse of, and that only need the baptism of experience to become universal. Light will be experimented with. That unknown agent of culture which makes barley ripen in 45 days under the latitude of Yakutsk, light concentrated or artificial, will rival heat in hastening the growth of plants. The Mauchit of the future will invent a machine to guide the rays of the sun and make them work, so that we shall no longer seek sun heat stored in coal in the depths of the earth. They will experiment the watering of the soil with cultures of microorganisms, a rational idea, conceived but yesterday, which will permit us to give to the soil those little living beings, necessary to feed the rootless. To decompose and assimilate the component parts of the soil, they will experiment. But let us stop here or we shall enter into the realm of fancy. Let us remain in the reality of acquired facts. With the processes of culture in use, applied on a large scale, and already victorious in the struggle against industrial competition, we can give ourselves ease and luxury in return for agreeable work. The near future will show what is practical in the processes that recent scientific discoveries give us a glimpse of. Let us limit ourselves at present to opening up the new path that consists in the study of the needs of men, and the means of satisfying them. The only thing that may be wanting to the revolution is the boldness of initiative. With our minds already narrowed in our youth, enslaved by the past in our mature age until the grave, we hardly dare to think. If a new idea is mentioned before venturing on an opinion of our own, we consult musty books 100 years old, to know what ancient masters thought on the subject. It is not food that will fail. If boldness of thought and initiative are not wanting to the revolution, of all the great days of the French Revolution, the most beautiful, the greatest, was the one on which delegates who had come from all parts of France to Paris worked all with the spade to plane the ground of the Champ de Mars, preparing it for the fate of the Federation. That day France was united. Animated by the new spirit, she had a vision of the future in the working in common of the soil. And it will again be by the working in common of the soil that the enfranchised societies will find their unity and will obliterate hatred and oppression which had divided them, henceforth, able to conceive solidarity, that immense power which increases men's energy and creative forces 100-fold. The new society will march to the conquest of the future with all the vigor of youth, leaving off production for unknown buyers, and looking in its midst for needs and tastes to be satisfied, society will liberally assure the life and ease of each of its members, as well as that moral satisfaction which work gives when freely chosen and freely accomplished, and the joy of living without encroaching on the life of others, inspired by a new daring. Thanks to the sentiment of solidarity, all will march together to the conquest of the high joys of knowledge and artistic creation. A society thus inspired will fear neither dissensions within nor enemies without. To the coalitions of the past it will oppose a new harmony, the initiative of each and all, the daring which springs from the awakening of a people's genius. Before such an irresistible force, conspiring kings will be powerless. Nothing will remain for them but to bow before it, and to harness themselves to the chariot of humanity, rolling towards new horizons opened up by the social revolution, the end. Also by Peter Kropotkin. Mutual aid. The factor in evolution Austin B078RWYJR5. In this powerful and thorough debunking of social Darwinism, the author explains how mutual cooperation within species ensures that those species survive and flourish, in animals as well as in humans. This is an important book to read for those interested in leftist thought, whether socialism, communism, or anarchism. We are stronger together. Fields, factories, and workshops. Austin B79-91 are 3 armed with a mass of figures. Kropotkin puts forward the evidence for communities and countries being self-sufficient in food and manufacturing, rather than the richer people and countries paying the poorer people and countries to do their work for them. Rather than forcing many of us to live our lives working meaningless jobs, this combination of evenly distributed manual work with brain work would allow us all to live fuller, richer lives. Memoirs of a Revolutionist. Austin B7H8B8XPN. Peter Kropotkin was born into a life of privilege and fortune, but ended it in exile. Heir to a princedom over thousands of serfs, he left his home and family and took up the revolutionary cause of anarchism. He dedicated his life to eradicating inequality and spreading the benefits of the earth to all humanity. Kropotkin wrote the foundational books in the library of anarchism, and worked ceaselessly to overthrow capitalism and promote anarchism. In this book, he tells of his early life in the royal palace and his army service in Siberia, along with his imprisonment, daring escape, and decades-long exile, because he speaks so much about those around him. His autobiography also functions as a gripping history of Russian politics in the second half of the 1800s,